He sat alone at a table for two, holding flowers for a woman who was never coming. On a Tuesday night in October, in a city that didn't care about heartbreak, Mason Reed checked his phone for the 11th time and watched the empty chair across from him blur at the edges. The waiter had stopped making eye contact. The candle between them flickered like it was embarrassed for him. He didn't know then, couldn't have known, that the woman who would change everything wasn't in that restaurant. She was already home, waiting. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain started around 6:15. Mason noticed because he'd left his umbrella at work again, the third time that month, and had to jog the last 4 blocks to Cafe Marin, a quiet Italian place on West Monroe that he'd chosen specifically because it wasn't too romantic. He didn't want to spook her. He'd made that mistake before, picking somewhere with candles and a violin player, and watching a woman's eyes go distant with the particular panic of someone realizing they were expected to feel something big on a first date. So he'd chosen Cafe Marin. Modest, warm lighting, a menu that didn't have anything with truffle oil. He'd made a reservation under Reed, party of 2. He'd bought yellow tulips from the cart on Michigan Avenue, the one run by an elderly Vietnamese man named Phuoc, who always gave him an extra stem and never asked why he was buying flowers on a Tuesday evening. He'd ironed his shirt. He'd told his daughter, 7-year-old Lily, that he'd be home by 9:30. He'd done everything right. He was standing outside the restaurant at 6:48, tulips under one arm, rain soaking through his collar, when his phone buzzed. Hey, so sorry to do this last minute. Something came up with work. Can we reschedule? Mason stood there for a moment in the rain, reading it twice. Then a third time, not because he didn't understand the words, but because some part of him was still deciding how to feel about them. Part of him, the hopeful, embarrassing, incurably optimistic part he usually kept locked in a closet, wanted to believe this was genuine, that something really had come up, that she hadn't simply looked at his profile again and decided he was too much work. No worries, he typed back. Hope everything's okay. He sent it before he could add anything else, like I drove 40 minutes in the rain for this, or I bought tulips, or I just wanted to have dinner with someone who wasn't 7 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs. He stood on the sidewalk for another 30 seconds. Then, because he was either stubborn or stupid and had never fully figured out which, he went inside anyway. Guy, the hostess, a young woman with a silver nose ring and the carefully neutral expression of someone who had seen everything, glanced at the tulips, then at the empty space beside him. Reservation for Reed, he said. Right this way. She seated him at a table near the window. 2 menus, 2 water glasses, 2 little folded napkins shaped like swans, because apparently Cafe Marin did that now. Mason set the tulips on the chair across from him and ordered a glass of red wine he didn't particularly want. He should have left. He knew that. There was no logical reason to sit alone in a restaurant after being stood up, eating bread and pretending to study a menu he'd already memorized online. But the apartment was 40 minutes away, and Lily was with Mrs. Kowalski next door until 9, and he'd already ironed the shirt. So he stayed. He ate the bread. He drank the wine too fast. He watched couples at nearby tables, a pair in their 50s arguing quietly about something that seemed to matter. A young man feeding his girlfriend bites of pasta off his fork, 2 women who were clearly on a first date and nervous in the best possible way. The waiter, a lanky kid named Brendan, who had introduced himself with the specific enthusiasm of someone working on their performance reviews, came by 3 times to ask if Mason was ready to order. Still waiting, Mason said each time. The 4th time, Brendan looked at the tulips on the empty chair and said nothing, just quietly refilled the water glasses with the mercy of someone who understood. By 7:45, Mason ordered the linguine. He ate it alone. He left a 30% tip because it seemed like the least he could do for putting Brendan through that, tucked the tulips under his arm, still wrapped in the plastic from Phuoc's cart, slightly rain-damp but intact, and walked out into the night. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building on North Halsted, between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese sandwich shop that Mason had eaten at so often that the owner's daughter waved at him by name. It was not a large apartment. Living room, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom that got cold in winter and steamy in summer, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in without bumping elbows. The walls were off-white with a faint yellow undertone that looked fine in photos and less fine in person. The heating system made a sound like someone dragging furniture at 2 in the morning. Mason had moved in 3 years ago, when Lily was 4, and he was still in the phase of grief where a man will make any decision that puts physical distance between himself and the place where his life used to be whole. The rent was manageable. The school 3 blocks away was decent. Mrs. Kowalski next door had a soft spot for kids and a habit of feeding Lily homemade pierogi without asking, which Lily considered this the greatest ongoing miracle of her existence. The second bedroom had been empty for almost a year when Evelyn moved in. It had started practically the way most things in Mason's life started. He'd put up a post on a neighborhood app, half expecting nothing. Room available, furnished, quiet building, good for someone who works long hours. Child-friendly household. He hadn't mentioned the dinosaur stickers on the hallway wall or the fact that he sometimes made pancakes at 10 p.m. when Lily couldn't sleep, and the smell of batter tended to drift under any closed door. Evelyn Carter had responded within an hour. She'd been brief, almost clinical. Working in the area for several months, prefer something quiet and low-key, fine with children. She'd offered to pay 3 months up front, which, practically speaking, had been the deciding factor. What he hadn't known then, and wouldn't fully understand for a long time, was that Evelyn Carter was not simply a professional passing through Chicago on a long assignment. She was the 30-year-old CEO of Meridian Technologies, a company that had been valued at $1.4 billion 18 months ago, before a corporate scandal involving a former board member had dragged her name into every financial news cycle in the country. She'd been cleared, completely, unambiguously cleared. But the internet doesn't care much about clearances. It cares about headlines. And for 6 brutal weeks, the headline had been Meridian, CEO Evelyn Carter, at center of board fraud investigation. She'd needed to disappear for a while. Not literally. She still had her company. She still flew to New York twice a month and sat through brutal board meetings and made decisions that affected 400 employees. But in Chicago, in the orbit of the people who'd spent those 6 weeks deciding whether she was guilty based on nothing but proximity to bad actors, she'd needed to be no one for a while. So she'd responded to a listing on a neighborhood app. She told Mason she worked in tech consulting. She'd paid 3 months up front and moved in with 1 suitcase, a laptop bag, and a box of books that were mostly philosophy and 2 embarrassing romance novels she'd buried at the bottom. The first few weeks had been politely awkward in the way that sharing a living space with a stranger always is. They'd worked out the logistics carefully. She used the kitchen after 8. He used it before. She kept her shoes by the door. He apologized in advance for Lily's volume levels on Saturday mornings. She said it was fine and had clearly expected it to not be fine, and then been genuinely surprised when a 7-year-old charging down the hall at 7 a.m. to show someone a drawing of a T-Rex didn't bother her as much as she'd anticipated. What Mason had noticed first about Evelyn was that she was quieter than anyone he'd ever shared a space with. Not cold, not unfriendly, just very, very contained. The way people get when they've learned that being visible is the same as being a target. She said what she needed to say, and not much more. She smiled at the right moments, and sometimes the smile reached her eyes and sometimes it didn't, and she was clearly practiced enough that most people couldn't tell the difference. Mason could tell. He didn't know why. Maybe because he'd spent 3 years learning to spot the distance between what a face was doing and what a person was actually feeling, from all the times he'd done it himself. She worked late. She ate dinner standing up at the counter most nights, reading something on her phone with the focused exhaustion of someone dismantling a problem. She put her heels by the door the moment she walked in, always. Heels off first, coat second, a single long exhale, and then she was just a person in socks navigating a kitchen. He noticed things like that. He noticed the way she made coffee, too strong, with a specific amount of sugar she'd measured exactly once, and then eyeballed every time after, which somehow always looked wrong, but apparently tasted right. The way she sang under her breath while she did dishes, quietly enough that she probably thought no one could hear her, fragments of songs that didn't match. Billie Holiday followed by something that sounded like it was from a 90s country album, followed by what might have been a commercial jingle. The way she left her philosophy books face down on the couch with the spines broken in a way that suggested she'd been arguing with the pages. He noticed when she was having a bad day because she made tea instead of coffee, and stood at the window and looked at the street below with the specific stillness of someone holding themselves very carefully together. He didn't ask. That was the deal. unspoken but understood. She didn't ask him about the woman whose photos he'd taken down from the living room wall and hadn't replaced. He didn't ask her why, for someone in tech consulting, she seemed to carry the particular weight of a person responsible for something enormous. They were, for nearly a year, very good at being politely separate people sharing a kitchen. Lily Reed was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn streak and a comprehensive understanding of dinosaurs that had humbled 3 separate adults at her school, including one teacher who had made the mistake of claiming the T-Rex was the biggest predator ever. She had been 4 when her mother died. She didn't have many clear memories of Sophie Reed, a few images that felt more like photographs than actual recollections. The smell of something specific she couldn't name, the sound of a voice she still sometimes heard at the edge of sleep. She didn't talk about it much, not because it didn't matter, but because she'd picked up, somewhere in the particular intelligence of small children, that it mattered enormously to her father in ways that made him quiet and far away. And she had spent 3 years instinctively navigating around that quiet, the way you navigate around a bruise. She liked Evelyn. She'd decided this on approximately day 3, when Evelyn had come home to find Lily sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor surrounded by dinosaur encyclopedias, apparently conducting research for a school project on carnivores. And instead of stepping around her the way adults usually did, Evelyn had sat down on the floor in her work clothes and said, "What are you working on?" Lily had looked up with the assessing gaze of a child who has learned that adults who ask questions don't always want actual answers. "Spinosaurus," she said carefully. "Semi-aquatic predator," Evelyn said, without looking up the reference. "Longer than T-Rex, probably. The fish-eating thing is interesting, right? Because most people picture it hunting like a land predator, but it was more like a heron." Lily had stared at her for a long moment. "How do you know that?" "I read a lot of things I don't need to know," Evelyn said. From that point forward, Lily considered Evelyn a person of worth. What Lily noticed, gradually, then all at once, the way things become obvious to children before adults are ready to admit them, was that her father was different around Evelyn. Not dramatically different. Not in the way adults in movies were different, all stammering and doing things with their hands, but subtly. The particular tension he carried in his shoulders, the careful politeness he wore around most people, the way he measured his words, it loosened when Evelyn was in the room. He laughed differently. Less like a man making the correct sound at the correct moment, more like a man who had forgotten to monitor himself. He cooked differently. He started making things he hadn't made in years. Not the functional dinners of a man feeding a child, but actual food. Roasted chicken with herbs, pasta from scratch, soup that required a significant amount of time standing over a stove, which didn't make logistical sense unless he was making it for someone who might appreciate it. Lily was 7 and thought about these things the way 7-year-olds think about things, directly and without much filter. And one evening in September, while her father was doing dishes and Evelyn was at the kitchen table helping her with a worksheet on fractions, Lily had looked up and said, "Do you like my dad?" Evelyn had gone very still for a fraction of a second. Not long. An adult wouldn't have caught it. Lily caught it. "Your dad is a very good person," Evelyn said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Evelyn looked at her for a moment with an expression Lily couldn't quite read, and then she smiled. The kind of smile that reached her eyes, the real one, and said, "You're going to be terrifying when you grow up." "I know," Lily said, and went back to her fractions. In the weeks leading up to that October Tuesday, Mason had been trying, consciously and with considerable effort, to move forward. He wasn't sure exactly what that meant, practically speaking. He'd been going through the motions of it for 2 years. Coffee dates that went nowhere, one dinner that had ended cordially with both parties clearly relieved, an ill-advised month of apps that had left him more exhausted than before he downloaded them. His friend Derek, who worked with him at the bookstore and had an opinion on everything, had told him repeatedly that he just needed to get back out there, and as though grief was something you could fix by repeated exposure to strangers. The woman on Tuesday, her name was Jenna, a coworker of Derek's, who had apparently mentioned Mason once at a work happy hour and been interpreted as interested, had seemed from their text exchanges warm and straightforward. They talked for a week. She'd mentioned a dog named Biscuit and a hatred of movie theater popcorn and a 3-year stint living in Seattle that she'd apparently spent mostly resenting the weather. She seemed fine. She seemed like a person with a real life. Mason had been genuinely looking forward to it in the way he'd learned to be careful about mildly, with expectation held at arm's length. Not because he was a pessimist, but because he'd learned the hard way that hoping loudly tended to make the drop worse. Still, yellow tulips, ironed shirt, the whole thing. And then the text. Hey, so sorry to do this last minute, something came up with work. He'd eaten alone. He'd tipped 30%. He'd walked home in the rain with flowers for no one, and somewhere in the last 4 blocks he'd had the humiliating and inconvenient thought that he was very tired of trying. Not life. He was not tired of life. He had Lily, he had the bookstore, he had the small, real things that kept the structure standing. But the specific act of presenting himself to strangers and hoping to be chosen, he was, in that moment, profoundly, boningly exhausted by it. He heard the apartment before he saw it. There was a light under the door, the warm, low kind that meant Evelyn had turned on the lamp in the living room rather than the overhead. He could smell something, vaguely, through the door. Tea, maybe, or something she'd been warming on the stove. He unlocked the door and pushed it open and stood there for a moment, dripping on the mat, tulips in one hand, the wet bag with his work things in the other. Evelyn was on the couch, with her legs folded under her, a mug in her hands, laptop open, but apparently forgotten. She looked up when he came in. She looked at him, not at the tulips, or at the wet shirt, or at the general picture of a man who had clearly just come from somewhere things had not gone well. She looked at his face with the particular directness she had, the thing about her he'd never quite gotten used to, the way she didn't look at people sideways. "You're back early," she said. "She canceled," he said, "before I got there." He said it flatly, not looking for sympathy, not performing it, just the fact of it. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. He set the tulips down on the counter, still in their plastic wrap, looking slightly tragic, and started pulling off his wet jacket. His back was to her. He heard the soft sound of her setting down the mug. "Mason." He turned. She was still on the couch, but she'd unfolded from it slightly, turned toward him. The lamplight caught the side of her face. She was still in her work clothes, but she'd undone the top button of her collar, which for Evelyn was approximately the equivalent of taking the whole thing off. Her expression was, he wasn't sure how to name it. Not pity. Something more complicated. The face of someone who had decided to say something they'd been not saying for a long time and was in the process of figuring out how to start. "You didn't have to do all that," she said quietly. "The dates." He looked at her. "What?" She set the mug on the coffee table, very carefully, like she was buying herself 2 extra seconds. "I mean, I know why you've been doing it, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. You deserve—" She stopped, started again. "I just mean, you didn't have to." Mason stood there with his jacket in his hands and the rain drying on his face and said, "I'm not sure I'm following you." Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time in nearly a year of living 4 feet from each other, she looked uncertain, not professionally uncertain, not the careful, calculated kind of uncertainty he occasionally saw in her when she was deciding how to handle something. Actually uncertain, the uncertainty of a person standing at an edge. "I wouldn't have turned you down," she said. The sentence landed in the apartment like something dropped from a considerable height. Mason didn't move. "Evelyn, you've gone on 11 dates," she said, and her voice was quiet but not small. "In 8 months. And every time you left, I kept thinking, She exhaled. "I wouldn't have. That's all I'm saying. I wanted you to know that." Mason stood there holding his jacket and looking at the woman he had spent 11 months not thinking too hard about, and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that was partway between vertigo and relief. He set the jacket down on the counter next to the tulips. He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Evelyn laughed slightly, and the laugh had an edge of self-awareness in it. "Because I rent from you, because I could see you were still figuring things out. Because I'm not—" She rubbed the side of her jaw. "I don't make things complicated. That's a thing I try very hard not to do, and this would have been complicated." "It's already complicated," Mason said. "I know." She looked at him. "I know it is." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The rain hit the window. The apartment was warm. The tulips sat on the counter in their plastic wrap, still technically for a woman named Jenna who'd had something come up at work. Mason walked slowly across the living room and sat down on the other end of the couch from Evelyn. Not close, Not the careful distance they usually maintained, but somewhere in the middle ground between those two things. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the coffee table. "I noticed you," he said, "a long time ago." Evelyn looked at him sideways. "I was trying not to," he said. "I was actively, consciously trying not to." He glanced over at her. "I'd come home and you'd be in the kitchen making that terrible over-sugared coffee and singing something from a 90s country album, and I'd think, I need to not do this, because you're my tenant, because you were clearly going through something, because I didn't want to be the guy who makes things weird." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "I sing too loud." "You really do." "I thought I was being quiet." "You were not." She laughed again, more genuinely this time, and pressed her fingers briefly to her forehead. "This is mortifying." "It was actually... no, it was nice." He said it simply. "It was one of the things that made the apartment feel..." He stopped. "Feel what?" "Less empty," he said. Something in Evelyn's face changed. Not dramatically. It was subtle. The slight softening around the eyes, the way her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch from where she'd been holding them, like she'd put something down. "I don't really talk about what I'm doing," she said after a moment. "My work, I mean. The full picture. You know that." "I know. There's been a lot happening with the company. I came to Chicago partly to get some distance from being watched all the time, from people making decisions about who I am based on things they read on their phones." She looked at the window. "I've been keeping my head down. I've been very careful. And then I moved in here and you treated me like a person. You didn't ask. You made dinner when I came home late. You introduced me to Lily like it was the most normal thing, and she showed me her dinosaur research, and She pressed her lips together. "I wasn't prepared for how much I needed something normal." "You sat on the kitchen floor with her," Mason said, "in your work clothes. She talked about that for a week." "She's a remarkable kid," Evelyn said softly. "She is." He looked at her. "She told me once, a few months ago, she said, 'I think Evelyn is sad sometimes, but not when she's here.'" Evelyn went very still. "She's 7, Mason said, but she's not wrong." Evelyn turned to look at him, and this time he could see it clearly. The thing she kept contained, the weight of it, the specific loneliness of a person who has learned that visibility is dangerous and privacy is armor, and the price of both is being known by very few people. "I hate watching you leave for those dates," she said quietly. "That's probably something I shouldn't say. Say it anyway." "Every time you'd get ready to go, you'd do that thing where you put on the jacket and check your reflection in the hall mirror, and you look like someone preparing for something they're not sure about." She shook her head slightly, "And I'd think, he's going to come home disappointed. And I'd think, I could have told him not to go." "Why didn't you?" She looked at him steadily. "Because what if you'd come home happy? What if it had worked? I wasn't going to take that away from you just because She stopped again. "Just because you what?" Evelyn Carter, who ran a billion-dollar company, who had navigated boardrooms and fraud investigations, and the particular brutality of being a young woman in a position of power, sat on a couch in a small apartment in North Halstead and looked at her landlord and said, "Just because I care about you more than I should." The tulips were still on the counter. Mason looked at them and then at Evelyn and said, "This is going to sound slightly ridiculous." "Okay. I bought those for a woman named Jenna, who I exchanged texts with for a week and didn't know at all." He paused. "And I've been living with you for 11 months. "That is slightly ridiculous, yes." "I want to have dinner with you," he said. "Not because I'm here anyway and you're here anyway. Actually, on purpose." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The careful, calculating part of her, the CEO, the one who ran probability assessments on every decision, was clearly auditing this information with some intensity. He could practically see her working through it. Then she said, "I have cheesecake in the fridge." He blinked. "What?" "I bought cheesecake yesterday from the place on Damen because I'd had a bad board call and I needed something to look forward to for 24 hours. She looked slightly embarrassed. "I have cheesecake, and I can make decent tea, and I think you have that jazz playlist you play when you think I'm asleep." Mason stared at her. "I'm not asking for a fairy tale," Evelyn said, and her voice was steadier now, more like herself, dry and clear-eyed and honest. I'm asking if you want to sit here and eat cheesecake and talk like we mean it. Yes, Mason said without hesitating. Okay. She unfolded herself from the couch and padded in her socked feet to the kitchen. Go put some music on. He put on the playlist. She cut the cheesecake, straight, even slices, which told him something about her he'd already suspected, and made 2 cups of tea with the methodical focus she brought to everything, and they sat back down on the couch, this time not at opposite ends of it, with the lamp on and the rain against the window and Miles Davis drifting in from the small speaker by the bookshelf. They talked for 3 hours. Not the surface-skimming, polite stranger talk of 11 months of careful coexistence. Actually talked. The tulips were still on the counter. The cheesecake was very good. Evelyn told him about the company, the actual version, not the consulting cover. She told him about the scandal, the 6 weeks of headlines, the specific horror of having people who'd never met her make confident pronouncements about her character in comment sections. She told him about building Meridian from a 20-person startup into something that employed 400 people, and the loneliness of being responsible for that, while everyone assumed you were either lucky or ruthless or both. Mason told her about Sophie, not the sanitized version, not the grief-processed, therapist vocabulary version he'd learned to give people when they inevitably asked. The real version. He told her what it had actually been like, the practical chaos of it, the shock of suddenly being solely responsible for a 4-year-old while barely able to get off the floor some mornings. The guilt of the moments when he'd been relieved it was over, when he'd been angry at Sophie for leaving, even though leaving was not a choice she'd made. The way Lily sometimes looked at him with her mother's exact eyes, and he didn't know whether to be grateful or devastated by that, and sometimes it was both simultaneously. Evelyn didn't say I'm so sorry in the way people usually did, the reflexive way, the way that was really about ending the conversation because grief made people uncomfortable. She said, that makes sense. And she meant it. They talked about Lily, about the way she'd decided Evelyn was worth trusting based on a conversation about a semi-aquatic dinosaur, about the drawing she'd given Evelyn last month of Evelyn, Dad, and me, rendered in crayon with everyone having extremely disproportionate heads and what appeared to be lasers coming out of Evelyn's eyes, which Evelyn had put on the inside of her bedroom door where she'd see it every morning. You put it on your door? Mason said. I put it on my door, Evelyn said, and looked at him directly, not apologetic about it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The jazz had shifted to something slower, and the cheesecake was finished, and it was almost midnight, and somewhere in the last 3 hours the 11 months of careful separateness had dissolved like sugar in hot water, quietly, completely, leaving only the thing that had always been underneath. Mason reached over slowly and touched her face, just his fingertips, at the edge of her jaw, a question more than anything else. Evelyn didn't move away. Can I kiss you? He asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended, the kind of quiet that isn't careful, the kind that's just real. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He could see the competing calculations in her face, not hesitation exactly, but the particular work of a woman who had learned to assess risk carefully and was now deciding, consciously, to stop. Her eyes were bright. Yes, she said. It wasn't cinematic. He didn't pull her in dramatically. She didn't gasp. It was tentative at first, careful. The particular tenderness of 2 people who had been pretending not to want this for long enough that the wanting had become its own kind of ache. Her hand came up to his wrist, not pushing him away, holding on. When they broke apart, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at him, and he saw something in her face he hadn't seen there before. Not composure, not control, not the careful presentation of a woman who had learned to give people a surface instead of an interior. Just Evelyn. Actually there. Actually present. Actually looking at him without any of the armor. He didn't say anything profound. He didn't have anything profound ready. He just looked at her and felt, for the first time in what seemed like an unreasonably long time, like something in his chest had finally stopped bracing for impact. The rain kept falling. The lamp stayed on. The tulips sat on the counter in their plastic wrap, irrelevant now, belonging to a night that had turned out to be something else entirely. Neither of them moved to leave. Well, Mason Reed had stopped expecting anything good. He'd stopped so quietly, so gradually, that he hadn't noticed himself doing it. The way you stop noticing a sound that's been there long enough. He noticed it now. Sitting in his own living room at midnight with a woman who knew his daughter's middle name and had put a crayon drawing on the inside of her door, He thought, oh, there it is. Still there after everything. Still there. The next morning arrived the way mornings do after nights that rearrange something fundamental. Too bright, too ordinary, aggressively indifferent to the fact that the people inside the apartment on North Halstead had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Mason woke at 6:15. Lily was still asleep. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt different from usual. Charged, somehow, the way the air feels different after a storm, even when the sun is out and there's nothing visibly changed. He lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling and inventorying what he felt. Not performing the inventory, actually doing it. There was the particular alertness of someone who hadn't slept deeply. They'd stayed up until past 1, talking, then sat with the awkwardness of two people who had kissed and now needed to navigate the architecture of a shared space that didn't have a guest room for feelings to sleep in. He'd walked her to her bedroom door, which was 6 feet from his bedroom door, and they'd stood in the hallway for a moment in the low light. "Good night," she'd said. Her voice was different, softer, less managed. "Good night," he'd said, and gone into his room, and lay there listening to the sound of her moving around on the other side of the wall. Now, at 6:15, he got up and made coffee because coffee was something he knew how to do. He was standing at the counter, waiting for it to brew, when he heard her door open. Evelyn came into the kitchen in sweatpants and an oversized gray t-shirt that said "Property of Northwestern Athletics" in faded letters, which was so different from her usual presentation that for a moment Mason forgot what he'd been doing with his hands. Her hair was down. She looked, without the armor of the professional version of herself, younger than 30 and tired in the way people look when they've slept, but not deeply. She saw him standing there and stopped for a half second, and he could see the same inventory happening behind her eyes, the same rapid recalibration of what the morning required. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She crossed to the cabinet and got her mug, the blue one, always the blue one, and poured herself coffee before it had quite finished brewing, which he'd told her twice made the last cup weaker, and which she'd acknowledged and continued doing. She stood at the counter next to him, not across from him, close. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "So," she said. "So," he said. "This is the part where it's weird," she said. "It's a little weird," he agreed. She looked at him sideways, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I've been thinking about it since about 3 a.m. I've been thinking about it since 6:15. That's either very healthy or not thinking about it enough." "Probably not thinking about it enough," he said, honestly. "I was mostly focused on making coffee." She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polished, social laugh he'd heard her produce at the right moments during phone calls she took in the living room, but the real one, the one that surprised her slightly. He'd heard it before, in small doses. He liked it considerably more than he'd let himself admit. "Okay," she said, after a moment, more serious. "I need to say something." "Okay?" She turned to face him, leaning back against the counter. She was holding the mug in both hands still, which he'd come to understand was a thing she did when she was about to say something that mattered, a kind of grounding. "Last night was not... I wasn't being impulsive. I know how it might look. Canceled date, you come home sad. I confess something. I don't want you to think..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I've been thinking about this for months, about what it would mean to say it, about whether it was the right thing to do. I'm not..." She exhaled. "I'm not someone who does things without thinking about them. I want you to know that." Mason looked at her. "I know that about you. I have a company. I have 400 employees. I have a board that spent 6 weeks deciding whether to trust me based on something I didn't do, and I spent 6 weeks watching them do it. And the thing that it taught me, the worst thing it taught me, was to be very, very careful about what I let matter." She looked at her coffee. "Because when things that matter go wrong, they don't just hurt. They take everything adjacent with them." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you're worried about? If this goes wrong?" "This is your home," she said. "And Lily's. And I'm..." She gestured at herself. "I'm a person who rented you a room. If this goes badly, it doesn't just get weird, it gets complicated in a way that's not fair to either of you. And I want..." She looked up at him. "I want to do this right. If we do this. I don't know how to do things halfway." It was, Mason thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. Not romantic honest. Not the confessional rush of someone swept up in a feeling, but the actual honest of a person looking directly at a situation and naming every variable. He set his coffee mug down. "Can I tell you what I think?" he said. "Please." "I think you're right that it's complicated," he said. "I think there's no version of this that doesn't have risk in it. I think I have a 7-year-old who already drew you into a family portrait with laser eyes, which is either the highest honor she can bestow or a really significant complication depending on how you look at it." He paused. "I think last night was the most honest conversation I've had with another person in about 3 years. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think I've spent a long time being careful not to want things. Because wanting things when you have a kid and a job and a life that barely fits together is a luxury you tell yourself you can't afford." He looked at her. "I don't want to do that anymore. I'm tired of it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. From down the hall came the unmistakable thunder of small feet hitting the floor, followed by the particular series of sounds that meant Lily was awake. A door yanked open, a trip over something, a muttered "ow" that was already forgotten before it was fully pronounced. And then she appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dinosaur pajamas, with her hair in complete chaos, looking between the two adults standing too close together at the counter with the assessing gaze of a 7-year-old who had clocked something. "What are you guys doing?" she said. "Making coffee," Mason said. "You're already holding coffee." "Making more coffee," Evelyn said. Lily looked at them for another moment with the scientific patience of someone who was not being fooled but had decided to file this information for future reference. Then she walked past them to the pantry, got out the box of cereal she ate every morning regardless of what else was available, and said, "We're out of almond milk." "There's regular milk," Mason said. "Regular milk makes the cereal soggy faster." "That is a valid concern," Evelyn said. Lily looked at Evelyn. "Can you get almond milk when you go to the store?" "I can do that," Evelyn said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to the table with her cereal. The moment passed the way domestic moments do, completely, without ceremony, folded back into the ordinary. But Mason caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen, and she caught his, and for a second something passed between them, something warm and complicated and entirely unprepared for. And she looked away first, into her coffee, with a small, private smile she probably didn't know he could see. He decided not to tell her he could see it. He'd save that for later. The next few days were a study in the specific awkwardness of two people renegotiating the terms of a shared space without a manual for how to do it. They hadn't defined anything. They hadn't had the conversation that defines things. They'd both, by unspoken agreement, circled around the word relationship like it was a structural beam they weren't sure could hold weight yet. What they had instead was a kind of heightened awareness that looked, from the outside, probably exactly like before. From the inside, it was like someone had turned the resolution up on everything. He noticed things he had already noticed, but differently. The way she moved around the apartment, that particular physical confidence of someone comfortable in her own body despite everything else, had a new charge to it, something that made him need to look elsewhere when she crossed the kitchen in the morning. The way she talked on work calls, pacing in front of the window, that low executive voice she used that was completely different from the voice she used at dinner, made him feel like he was watching two different people he'd been given private access to. She was less contained around him. He could see her making the choice to be, which was somehow more intimate than if it had come naturally. The deliberate act of lowering something that had been built high. She started eating dinner at the table instead of standing over the counter. Not every night. Some nights she still came home too late and too wiped out for anything other than reheating whatever he'd left in the fridge and eating it in the particular silence of someone running on empty. But the night she did sit down, she sat down differently. She asked Lily about school. She told Mason things about her day in more than 3 sentences. The night that something shifted from tentative to real was a Thursday in late October, 4 days after the tulips. Lily had a school project, a poster about the water cycle, due Friday, that she had mentioned exactly once 3 weeks ago and then apparently not thought about again until Thursday at 7 p.m. Mason discovered this while making dinner, found the project description at the bottom of Lily's backpack along with a permission slip from September and several fossilized crackers, and had a brief, private moment in his kitchen that involved pressing his forehead to the cabinet door and breathing through his nose. "Everything okay in there?" Evelyn called from the living room. "Fine," he said. A pause. That was a very specific "fine." He came to the doorway. Lily has a poster due tomorrow about the water cycle. Evelyn looked over the back of the couch. That she's starting tonight? That she's starting tonight. Lily appeared at the end of the hall. She had the look of a child who knows she has done something she cannot undo and is calculating the best angle of approach. I forgot, she said. I know you forgot, Mason said. It's not a big poster. Lily, it's medium. Mason pinched the bridge of his nose. Go get your poster board. We don't have poster board. Of course we don't. I can go get it, Evelyn said, already getting up from the couch. There's a Walgreens on the corner. You don't have to. I'm going anyway. I need toothpaste. She was already putting her shoes on. What color board? Lily considered this with inappropriate gravity given the circumstances. Yellow, she said. No. Green. No. Yellow. I'll get both, Evelyn said, and was out the door before Mason could say anything else. She came back 15 minutes later with yellow poster board, green markers, a pack of colored pencils that Lily had not requested but immediately fell upon with the devotion of someone receiving exactly what they needed, and inexplicably a large bag of Twizzlers. Those are for after the poster is done, she told Lily. That's very strategic, Mason said. I have some experience motivating people. She set everything on the kitchen table. Okay, water cycle. What do you have so far? Nothing, Lily said cheerfully. Right, pull up your notes. What followed was 2.5 hours of kitchen table chaos. Lily drawing, erasing, arguing with Evelyn about where the arrows for evaporation should go, Mason looking up diagrams on his phone and holding them up for reference, Evelyn at one point lying on her stomach on the floor to assess the poster from Lily's eye level and declaring that the condensation clouds were too small and needed to be twice the size, which led to an argument about artistic interpretation versus scientific accuracy that Mason stayed well out of. At 9:45, they stepped back from the table and looked at the finished poster. It was genuinely very good. The water cycle was rendered in blue and green with careful arrows, a small sun in the corner that Lily had given sunglasses to, and cloud formations that were scientifically approximate even if they were also somewhat expressive. That's a solid B+, Evelyn said. Why not an A? Lily demanded. The sun doesn't need sunglasses. That's editorial, not scientific. The sun is cool. The sun is a star and doesn't have aesthetic preferences. Lily considered this. Ms. Patterson will like the sunglasses. Ms. Patterson might like the sunglasses, Evelyn allowed. Okay, a minus. Lily looked at Mason. Mason shrugged. I think the sun looks great. Dad, Lily said, with the particular tone of a child who has decided that parental support doesn't count when it's unconditional. Evelyn was cleaning up the markers when Lily looked up at her and said, without preamble, Are you and my dad dating now? Evelyn's hand stopped on the marker cap. Mason felt the kitchen go very still. Lily, he started. I'm just asking, Lily said reasonably, because you're different now. You were already different before, but now you're different in a different way. She looked between them. I'm not mad. I'm just asking. Evelyn and Mason looked at each other across the kitchen table, over the water cycle poster and the Twizzlers bag and the debris of colored pencils. The look lasted about 2 seconds. It contained approximately 40 different things. Then Evelyn looked at Lily and said, What do you think about that? If we were? Lily thought about it with genuine seriousness. I think it's fine, she said, but you'd have to keep helping me with homework, and Dad needs to stop burning the grilled cheese. I burn it once. Every time, Lily and Evelyn said simultaneously. There was a brief silence. Then Lily gathered her poster very carefully, said good night to both of them in the businesslike tone of someone who has resolved a matter to her satisfaction and was done with it, and went down the hall to her room. Mason and Evelyn stood in the kitchen. She's 7, Mason said. She's terrifying, Evelyn said. Those are both true. Evelyn looked down at the table. She was still holding a green marker. She set it down, carefully. Am I? She asked, and her voice had gone quiet. Dating you? Mason looked at her. She was looking at the table, not him, which was unusual enough that he understood it. She was asking something real and didn't want to watch his face while she waited for the answer. Do you want to be? He asked. A pause. Yes, she said. Just that. Like she'd already decided a long time ago,
and was only now saying it. "Then, yes," he said, "you are." She looked up then, and there was the same thing he'd seen on her face the night of the kiss, that unguarded version of her, the one without the professional finish over everything. She looked, in that moment, like someone who had wanted something for long enough that being allowed to have it felt slightly unreal. "Okay," she said. "Okay."
She started cleaning up the table again, but she was smiling. A real smile, the kind that she was apparently bad at hiding when she stopped trying. Mason ate the last Twizzler and decided this was the best Thursday he'd had in years. What he hadn't fully anticipated, what neither of them had fully anticipated, though Evelyn would later say she should have, given that she spent her professional life anticipating contingencies, was how the world outside the apartment would feel about the choices being made inside it. The first complication arrived the following week in the form of a phone call. Mason was at the bookstore, Renner and Sons, an independent on Milwaukee Avenue that had survived 3 recessions, 2 fires, and the rise of online retail through sheer stubbornness and an extremely loyal customer base, sorting a shipment of new inventory with his coworker Derek, who was tall and loud and had opinions about everything, and had been Mason's closest friend since they'd both worked a Christmas rush 6 years ago and survived it. Derek had been the one to set up the date with Jenna. He had also, for approximately 8 months, been delivering a running commentary on Mason's failure to notice that his roommate was, in Derek's words, objectively extraordinary. "And in your kitchen every day, man, I don't know what you're waiting for." So when Mason arrived at the bookstore on a Monday morning with what Derek immediately identified as a specific expression, an expression Derek had not seen on Mason's face in a very long time, Derek stopped shelving books and said, "Something happened." "I don't know what you're talking about," Mason said. "You look like a person who slept badly for a good reason," Derek said. "Talk." Mason put down the box he was carrying. He told Derek, briefly and with the instinct to keep something private even while acknowledging it, that things had changed with Evelyn, that they'd talked, that he'd used the word something, which Derek immediately identified as inadequate. "Something," Derek repeated. "Something," Mason said. "I don't know what to call it yet." "Does she know what to call it?" "We talked about it." "What did she call it?" "Dating," Mason admitted. Derek pointed at him. "That is not nothing. I know it's not nothing. I've been telling you for 8 months. "I know you have." 8 months. Derek spread his hands. "You are the most patient, frustrating person I have ever met in my life." "I was being careful," Mason said. "You were being scared," Derek said, and then, before Mason could respond, added, "Which is fine. I'm just saying, both things." Mason didn't argue with that. What Derek said next, though, was the beginning of the complication. "Does she know about Sophie? Like, actually know?" "Yeah," Mason said. "The whole thing?" "Yeah." Derek nodded slowly. "Okay." He picked up a book and shelved it. "Because that matters. She needs to understand what she's getting into with the whole..." He made a vague gesture that encompassed, apparently, the concept of grief and single fatherhood. "She does," Mason said. "She grew up knowing hard things. Still different when it's yours." Mason thought about that for the rest of the morning. The second complication arrived that same evening from Evelyn's direction. She came home later than usual, almost 9, which wasn't rare but happened tonight with a specific energy, a door closing a little too precisely, the way she moved through the kitchen when she needed to decompress something. Mason was reading on the couch. Lily was asleep. He looked up when Evelyn came in. "Bad day?" he said. "Medium day with a bad ending." She sat down in the armchair. Not the couch. The armchair, which put more distance between them. He noticed but didn't say anything. "I had a call with my communications director this afternoon about the quarterly investor update." She kicked off her heels. "He asked, by the way, if the rumors were true." Mason looked at her. "What rumors?" "Apparently someone at the building where I hold my Chicago meetings saw me on the street with you last weekend and said something to someone who said something to someone else." She pressed 2 fingers against her temple. "It's not a news story. It's barely a rumor. But the question was whether I'm seeing someone, and if so, whether that someone is appropriate given the company's current public relations situation." "Appropriate," Mason repeated. "I'm quoting him." "What did you say?" "I told him my personal life was not a variable in the company's communication strategy." She said it flatly, with the particular precision of someone who had delivered the sentence recently and was still feeling the shape of it. And he said, very politely, that my personal life had been a variable in the company's communication strategy for the last 18 months, whether I liked it or not. The room was quiet for a moment. He's not wrong, Evelyn said. That's the part I hate. He's not entirely wrong. What does appropriate mean in this context? Mason asked. Because I'd like to understand what the problem actually is. She looked at him. It means, and I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what my world is like, not because I'm agreeing with it. It means that a billionaire tech CEO, in the middle of an image recovery process, beginning a relationship with a bookstore manager who lives in a walk-up on Halstead Street, is going to look, to certain people, like a story. She said the word story with a very specific tone. Not a real one. A type. The kind that gets written about with either she's lost her mind or isn't that charming, depending on who's writing it. Mason sat with that for a moment. He was aware of a particular feeling that he identified after a few seconds as the old reflex, the one that said, "You're not enough for this. You knew this would happen. You shouldn't have let yourself." He was also aware of it being a reflex rather than a fact, which didn't make it quieter, but made it slightly more manageable. "Is that what you think?" he said. "That it looks like a type?" "No," she said immediately. "I think it is what it is. I'm telling you what my communications director thinks. And I'm telling you because I need you to know that this being with me is not quiet. I can try to keep things quiet for a while, but eventually it won't be. And I need you to know that before..." She stopped. "Before we go further." Mason looked at her across the apartment. She was sitting in the armchair with her heels off and her professional day face still on, but her hands were in her lap, and she was watching him with the particular care of someone who was genuinely uncertain of an outcome. He thought about Lily's drawing on the inside of her door. He thought about the kitchen floor and the Spinosaurus. He thought about 11 months of a woman singing quietly in the kitchen thinking no one could hear. "I'm not worried about that," he said. "You should think about it seriously." "I have thought about it," he said. "I thought about it in the 2 seconds it took you to say it, and I'll probably think about it more later. But I'm not someone who's going to look at a person I care about and decide they're too complicated because their life is bigger than mine." He paused. "Lily's mom was sick for 2 years before she died. I know what complicated means. I'm not afraid of it." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. "You're going to make this very difficult for me to talk myself out of," she said. "Good," he said. "Stop trying." She pressed her lips together. The armchair distance thing had clearly lost the argument. She got up, crossed the room, and sat next to him on the couch. She didn't lean into him or do anything demonstrative. She just sat next to him, close enough that their arms were touching. And after a moment, she exhaled, and some of the day came off her. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he said. They sat like that for a while, reading and not reading in the lamplight while the city made its city noises beyond the window. It was a Tuesday. It was completely ordinary. Mason thought about Derek saying both things and decided that both things was probably right about most things. The week following that conversation had its own rhythms, good ones mostly, interrupted by the ordinary friction of two people figuring out how to exist in a new register of the same small space. There was the Wednesday morning when they'd both reached for the coffee maker at the same time and ended up in a brief, uncoordinated collision that resulted in Mason spilling approximately a quarter cup on the sleeve of her jacket, and Evelyn saying, It's fine," in a voice that clearly meant it is fine. "But also I have a meeting in 40 minutes. There was the evening Lily had a nightmare and woke up crying, and Mason went to her room and sat with her, and Evelyn heard from behind her door and came out to the hallway in her sleep clothes and stood there for a moment, uncertain whether she was intruding, and Mason had looked up from Lily's doorway and said, "She's okay, just a bad dream." And Evelyn had said, "Okay," and gone back to her room, and he'd heard her moving around in there for a while after, not asleep, probably doing what she did when she couldn't turn her head off, which he'd learned by then was reading philosophy with a glass of water, sitting cross-legged on her bed. He knew small things about her now. He'd always known small things, months of accidental observation. But now he was allowed to know them, and that was different. On Friday evening of that week, he knocked on her bedroom door. She opened it. She was in the Northwestern t-shirt and sweatpants again, the off-duty uniform he was learning, with her hair back and reading glasses on that she immediately took off and held like she'd been caught with them.
You don't have to do that, he said. Do what? Hide the glasses. She looked at him. I'm not hiding them. You took them off in under a second. I was done reading. You were not done reading. She put them back on with a kind of deliberate dignity. What did you need? He'd made dinner. Actually made it, not the functional weeknight version, but a real one. Chicken roasted with garlic and herbs, the way she'd once mentioned offhandedly she liked, but had never specified. Pasta. Bread from the bakery down the block. I made dinner, he said. She looked past him toward the kitchen. The smell had clearly reached her before he'd knocked, which was probably why she'd already been reading with slightly less focus. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, he said. She looked at him with the glasses still on, and she had that expression again. The one she got when something small and real got through the composure in a way she hadn't been bracing for. Something slightly undone in the eyes. Something working at the corner of her mouth. Okay, she said. Lily had a sleepover at a classmate's house that night. The first time in 3 weeks that the apartment had been genuinely quiet after 8 p.m., which felt both like an enormous gift and slightly strange, like the apartment didn't know what to do with its own volume. They sat at the kitchen table with the food and 2 glasses of red wine and the lamp on and the October dark against the windows. And it was, Mason thought, the first time he'd had a proper dinner with another adult in this apartment since Sophie. That thought arrived without warning, and he sat with it for a moment, turning it over. Not with guilt. He'd moved past the phase where everything was a betrayal, mostly, but with the weight of it. The way things that have changed still carry the memory of what they were before they changed. Evelyn was watching him. Where'd you go? She said. Nowhere, he said. Then, because she had asked and she meant it, thinking about the last time I made dinner for someone. She didn't look away or steer around it. Sophie? Yeah. She nodded, once. Let it sit. He appreciated that about her. Possibly one of the things he appreciated most, though he hadn't said it, that she didn't rush him past things, that she didn't make his grief a problem to be solved or a topic to be carefully exited. She just let it exist in the room the way it needed to. I'm not trying to replace anything, she said, after a moment. I want you to know that. I know this is... She moved her hand slightly, indicating everything. The dinner, the apartment, the last few weeks. I know this sits on top of something real that happened. I'm not trying to paper over it. I know you're not, he said. I just want to be clear. You're very good at being clear, he said. That's not always a compliment, but tonight it is. She looked at him over her wine. Was that a joke? A very small one. From a man who bought tulips for a stranger on a Tuesday. Those were good tulips. They absolutely were, she said, and she smiled, and he smiled back, and the apartment was warm and quiet and full of something that had been missing from it for a very long time. They ate the whole dinner. They finished the wine. They talked about her company. Not the scandal version, not the investor version, but the actual version, the one about building something from a specific idea about how technology could work better and watching it become real, and all the ways the reality was different from the idea, and how you learned to love the messy actual version of a thing rather than the clean version you started with. He told her about the bookstore, about the way he'd come to it sideways. He'd been in marketing before Sophie got sick. A job he'd neither hated nor loved, but had done competently for 6 years. After, he'd needed something smaller, something with walls you could see from one end. He'd applied to Renner & Sons on something close to instinct, and they'd hired him to manage inventory, and he'd worked his way into running the place and found, gradually, that something about a room full of books did something that the open plan marketing office had never done. It's quiet, he said. People come in quiet. They browse quiet. Even the kids section is a different kind of noise. It's not the kind that wears you down. You like it, Evelyn said. Not a question, a recognition. I do, he said. I didn't expect to. I thought it was a temporary thing. Most permanent things start that way, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at her wine glass, turning the stem slowly. Then she looked up and caught him looking and didn't look away. The evening went quiet and warm around them. The empty chair that had been a wound on Tuesday was just a chair now. The tulips were long gone. He'd thrown them out 2 days ago, already wilting, their purpose having been surpassed by the thing they'd accidentally started. It was late when they finally moved from the table.
He washed the dishes while she dried them, standing next to each other in the kitchen that was barely big enough for two people without bumping elbows. They bumped elbows. Neither of them moved away. At the doorway to the hall, the same doorway, the same 6 feet of corridor between their two rooms, she turned toward him and he turned toward her. And it was different this time from the first night. The first kiss had been tentative, a question being carefully asked. This was an answer. He pulled her in by the waist, and she came without hesitation, and the kiss was warmer and more certain than the first, the kind that knows it's not the last. When she pulled back, she kept her hands at his collar and looked at him for a moment in the low light. "This is either going to be the best decision I've ever made," she said, "or I'm going to have a very hard time finding a new apartment." He laughed. Actually laughed. The real one. The one that surprised him. "I'll give you a good reference either way." She shook her head slightly and went to her door, and she was smiling when she opened it. He stood in the hallway for a moment after her door closed, listening to the building settle around him, and thought about Derek saying both things, and thought about Lily's crayon drawing with the laser eyes, and thought about a Tuesday in October when he'd bought tulips that were meant for someone else entirely. The lamp in the living room was still on. He went and turned it off, and stood in the dark apartment for a moment, and felt, not the vertigo thing, not the disoriented edge of something new, but something slower and more solid. Like finding a room you didn't know the house had. Like coming home to something you'd thought you lost. November arrived without ceremony, the way November in Chicago always does. Not gradually, not with warning, but overnight, like someone flipped a switch and decided that autumn was finished and everyone needed to adjust accordingly. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a weekend. The leaves that had been hanging on with stubborn color all through October gave up and came down in sheets. The sky went the particular flat gray of a city that had made peace with being cold for the next 5 months. Mason noticed the season change the way he noticed most things now, through Evelyn's reaction to it. She hated the cold. This was not a small preference. It was a deep physiological objection that expressed itself every morning when she opened the apartment door and the November air hit her, producing a sharp inhale through her nose, and a very specific look, like someone being personally wronged by the weather. She layered. She had more coats than made practical sense for a person who spent most of her time in climate-controlled offices and cars. She made the thermostat a subject of ongoing negotiation that Mason had learned to approach diplomatically. "You grew up in Boston," he said one morning, watching her wrap a scarf around herself 3 times before stepping into the hallway. "I grew up in Boston hating the cold," she said. "Where do you think I learned to hate it?" He didn't argue. He ordered a second electric blanket for her room that week and left it outside her door without comment. She came out of her room the next morning, looked at him over her coffee and said, "Thank you," with the slight undone quality she got when something small and practical got to her more than she expected. Those were the weeks of small things, accumulating. The way a relationship, real, working relationship, gets built is not in the grand gestures. It's in the layered accumulation of small knowledge. The fact that Evelyn's phone started buzzing before 6 a.m. most mornings with New York time zone urgency, and that she'd learned to silence it before it woke Lily, suggested a consideration she didn't announce. The fact that Mason had quietly memorized the specific ways she liked her tea after a bad day, very hot, not the usual amount of sugar, with a piece of whatever baked thing was available presented without commentary, suggested something similar on his end. Lily had accepted this situation with the supreme practicality of a child who had already processed its emotional content and moved on. She did not treat Evelyn differently in any dramatic way. She simply stopped pretending that Evelyn was a guest. The way she occupied the apartment, her drawings spread across the kitchen table, her sneakers in the hall next to Evelyn's heels, her total comfort in asking Evelyn to look at something or reach something or explain something, reflected an adjustment that had already been made internally, quietly, without ceremony. What was harder, what neither Mason nor Evelyn had quite braced for, was the first time the outside world pushed back against what they had built inside. It started with a dinner. Evelyn had been keeping her Chicago life carefully compartmentalized since long before Mason. Her work dinners happened in the Loop, in private rooms of restaurants where photographers didn't linger because the clientele had lawyers. Her board calls happened on her laptop in her room with the door closed. When she needed to meet people, she met them in professional contexts. And when she was done, she came home to North Halsted and took off her heels and became the version of herself that existed only in this apartment. The dinner was with a woman named Claire Ashworth, senior partner at a venture firm that had been with Meridian since its Series A. Someone Evelyn had known for 6 years and trusted in the particular way you trust someone you've survived difficult things alongside. Claire was sharp and direct and had an instinct for people that had served her well for 3 decades in finance. She'd texted Evelyn at noon. In Chicago through Thursday. Dinner tonight? Lula's 7. Evelyn had said yes, because saying no to Claire Ashworth for no articulable reason was not something you did. She'd mentioned it to Mason over coffee that morning, casually. Too casually, he thought, in the way people mention things they're thinking about more than they let on. He'd nodded and said he'd handle dinner for Lily. What he hadn't anticipated was that Claire Ashworth had a gift for noticing things, and absolutely no policy against mentioning what she noticed. Evelyn came home at 10:15. Mason was on the couch with a book he'd been reading the same 3 pages of for an hour, which was not something he planned to mention. She came through the door with the particular energy of someone who had been performing all evening and was done performing, coat off fast, heels by the door, a long exhale that she held for a second too long before releasing. "How was it?" he said. She dropped onto the couch and pulled her knees up. "Fine. Good, actually. Claire is—" She paused. "She asked about you." Mason looked up. "She knows about me?" "Apparently I mentioned you." She was looking at the coffee table. "In the past, without fully registering that I was doing it." He waited. "She said, her words, that she'd noticed I seemed less like I was drowning, and she'd assumed it was work stabilizing. And then I said something tonight about Lily's poster project, and she said, 'Who's Lily?'" Evelyn pressed her fingers briefly to her jaw. "And I explained, and she got the particular expression that Claire gets when she's finished processing something and arrived at a conclusion." "What conclusion?" Evelyn looked at him. She said, "Evelyn, do you know that this is the first time in 3 years you've talked about someone else's child with that kind of—" She made a slight motion with her hand. "Ease? You've been talking about this family for 20 minutes and you don't even realize it." The apartment was quiet. "She wasn't wrong," Evelyn said. Mason set the book down. "She asked if it was serious," Evelyn said. "I told her it was real. I don't know if that's the same thing, but it's what I said." "What did she say to that?" Evelyn half smiled. "She said, 'Good. You've been building walls for 2 years and it's exhausting to watch.'" She looked at him. "She also said I should bring you to a dinner sometime and let her assess you, which is Claire for 'I care about you and I vet the people in your life.' Should I be nervous about that?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation, "but for normal reasons. She's just intense." He nodded, then carefully, "Are you okay? With her knowing?" Evelyn thought about it, actually thought, not deflected. "I don't know how to do this quietly forever," she said. "I knew that. I told you that." She leaned her head back against the couch. Every time someone from my world finds out, it becomes a thing that's examined. And what we have," she stopped, seemed to locate the right word. "It doesn't want to be examined yet. It's still new," he said. "New," she agreed. "It's still new, and I want to keep it careful for a little while longer." He reached over and found her hand on the couch cushion between them, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his without making it a moment, just a fact, and they sat like that while the apartment settled around them. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" She looked at him sideways. "We keep it careful a little longer," he said. "That's fine with me." She looked at him for a moment with that expression, the real Evelyn expression, not the CEO one, and squeezed his hand once. "You're very even-keeled," she said. "It's disorienting." "I have a 7-year-old," he said. "Nothing phases me anymore." From down the hall, as if on cue, came the sound of Lily's voice. "Dad? I can't sleep." Mason looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Mason. "She definitely heard us come in," Evelyn said. "She absolutely did," he said, and went down the hall. He sat on the edge of Lily's bed for 20 minutes while she told him about a problem at school. A friend named Cassie had told another friend that Lily had said something she hadn't said, and the whole thing had metastasized into the complex social drama of second-grade relationships, which operated by its own laws and required careful navigation. He listened without rushing her. When she was done, he told her that Cassie was probably dealing with something she didn't know how to talk about directly,
and that it didn't make what Cassie did okay, but it made it explainable. How do you know? Lily said. Because I've met a lot of adults who still do the same thing, he said. Lily thought about that. That's depressing. A little bit, he admitted, but it also means you already understand something a lot of adults are still figuring out. She considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved and then said, "Can you tell Evelyn I said goodnight?" "You can tell her yourself," he said. "She's still up." Lily got out of bed with the speed of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, patted down the hall, and pushed open the living room door. Mason heard Evelyn's voice. "Hey you okay?" And then Lily's voice, launching immediately into the Cassie situation, and Evelyn saying, "Okay, hold on, start from the beginning." He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to his daughter talk, and the woman on the couch respond with the genuine, engaged attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. He thought about Derek saying both things. He thought about it being both the complicated, uncertain, externally scrutinized thing it was becoming, and this, a Tuesday night, his daughter in her pajamas getting advice from someone who had no obligation to give it, and did anyway. He went back to the living room. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the couch next to Evelyn, mid-explanation, hands moving the way they did when she was deep into a story. Evelyn was listening with her reading glasses off and her full attention on, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. Mason sat in the armchair and picked up his book and didn't read a single word of it. The first real test came 10 days later, and it arrived from a direction Mason hadn't expected. Sophie's mother called on a Saturday morning, Patricia Reed. She had kept the name after the divorce from Sophie's father, kept it because it was Lily's name too, and that mattered to her, called every 2 weeks without fail. She'd been a constant since Sophie died, one of the few constants, steady, reliable, present. She lived in Evanston and drove down to take Lily to the Natural History Museum roughly once a month, and had a standing Saturday morning call with Mason that was, on its surface, about Lily's week but was actually about making sure Mason was still functional. He'd been grateful for it. Patricia was not a difficult person. She'd never made him feel like a caretaker who'd been assigned the job. She treated him like family, which he supposed he was, in the category of family that exists without the structure to name it. What Mason had not told Patricia was anything about Evelyn. This was not an active choice exactly. It was more that the two things existed in different compartments of his life, and he'd been allowing the compartments to stay separate while he figured out what was happening. But when Patricia called on that Saturday morning and he stepped into the bedroom to take it privately, something he didn't usually do, something Evelyn noticed from the kitchen and deliberately didn't comment on, he had the awareness of someone carrying something he was about to be asked about. "How's my girl?" Patricia said. This was always how she started. It meant Lily. "Good," Mason said. "She did a water cycle project this week, got an A-." "Only an A-?" She gave the son sunglasses. "That sounds like an A to me." "That's what she said." He sat on the edge of his bed, heard, faintly, the kitchen sounds. Evelyn making coffee, Lily asking something, a brief exchange he couldn't make out. "She's good, growing about a foot a month. Last week she informed me that the velociraptor was actually the size of a turkey, and everything I knew was wrong." Patricia laughed. He heard her settle into what was probably her kitchen chair, the one by the window, the one she took calls from. "And you? How are you?" There was a pause here, slightly longer than usual. "Good," he said. Then, because Patricia had known him long enough to hear gaps, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." He heard the quality of her silence change. "There's someone," he said. The phrase felt clumsy. He pushed through it. "My roommate. We've been living together, as roommates, for almost a year, and things have changed in the last few weeks. He stopped. "I wanted you to hear it from me." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about her," she said. Her voice was measured, not cold, not warm, careful. He told her. The relevant things: Evelyn's age, her work, how long she'd been living there, the way she was with Lily. He kept it factual at first and then found, as he talked, that the factual version didn't fully contain what he was trying to say. So he said, "She's good with Lily, not in a performed way. She sits on the floor and talks about dinosaurs, and she put one of Lily's drawings on the inside of her door." Another pause. "How does Lily feel about it?" Patricia asked. "She asked me directly if we were dating," he said.
and then told me I needed to stop burning the grilled cheese. A small sound on the other end. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent. That sounds like her. It does. The silence stretched a few more seconds. He waited it out. He knew Patricia. She was processing, not stalling. She was a woman who took time with things that mattered and said what she meant when she got there. Mason, she said, finally. Yeah, Sophie's been gone for 3 years. I know. You're 32 years old and you're a good father and you've been running on empty for a long time. Her voice was careful, but not small. I want you to know that I want you to be happy. I mean that. She was my daughter, and I want you to be happy because that's what she would have wanted and because you deserve it as a person, separate from everything else. He felt something tighten in his chest. Thank you, he said. And I'd like to meet her, Patricia said. When it's right. I'm not making demands. I just would like to know the person who's around my granddaughter. I understand, he said. I'll make that happen. Okay, he heard her exhale. Tell Lily I'll pick her up Thursday for the museum. I will. And Mason? Yeah? Burn the grilled cheese if she's there. It means she's home. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment after he hung up, in the particular stillness of a call that had gone better than feared and harder than expected. Then he went back out to the kitchen. Evelyn was at the counter. She didn't ask. She looked at him with a question in her eyes and let him choose whether to answer it. That was Sophie's mom, he said. Evelyn put down her mug. Okay. I told her about us. A pause. How did she take it? She wants to meet you, he said. Eventually, when it's right. Evelyn absorbed this. That's reasonable, she said. Not defensively, just reasonably. She misses Sophie, he said. She always will. I will too. That doesn't... He stopped. Tried again. That doesn't mean I can't also have this. I know that, Evelyn said. I've always known that. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it for me. She looked at him steadily. Okay, she said softly. Say it as many times as you need to. It was one of the things about her that still caught him sometimes. The specific quality of her attention when something real was happening. The complete absence of performance, of social management, of trying to say the right thing. She'd just received it. Let it be what it was. He'd known people his entire life, good people, caring people, who couldn't do that, who filled silences because silence felt like failure. Evelyn didn't. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead, briefly, and she reached up and held his wrist for a second before he moved away, and that was all of it. The whole thing, contained in that exchange, no words required. Lily looked up from her cereal. Are you guys being mushy? No, Mason said. You're being mushy, Lily said, with the distinct disapproval of a child who considered mushiness an aesthetic violation. Eat your cereal, Evelyn said. You're both mushy, Lily said, and ate her cereal. What Mason didn't tell Evelyn that morning, what he was still figuring out how to carry, was that the call with Patricia had opened something, not destructively. More like the way you open a window in a room that's been closed a long time. The air changed, things rearranged slightly, dust moved. He'd been managing grief for 3 years, not suppressing it. He'd done enough therapy to know the difference, and he wasn't the type to pretend things were fine when they weren't. But managing it, keeping it in a shape he could navigate around, a presence he could account for in his daily geometry. The grief was there, had been there, would continue to be there in the particular way that doesn't go away so much as integrate. What he'd been less prepared for was the guilt, not the irrational survivor guilt. He'd processed most of that. The more specific guilt of happiness. The way that choosing to be happy, choosing to be with someone, felt on certain mornings like an implicit argument that the grief was finished, which it wasn't. That he had moved on, which wasn't quite the right way to describe it. That Sophie had been replaceable, which was not at all what was happening, but which some part of him couldn't stop examining. He thought about this on Monday evening, after Lily was asleep, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with her laptop, working through something with the focused quiet she brought to late evening tasks. She had her glasses on and hadn't noticed him looking. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. Do you think it's possible to carry grief and also be happy? Not in different moments. Simultaneously. She considered it seriously, which was the thing he'd always appreciated. She never dismissed a real question with a reassuring non-answer. I think they're not as separate as people like to pretend, she said. I think grief is just love with nowhere to go, and love doesn't stop existing because the person is gone. She paused. So, yeah, I think it's possible. I think it might actually be the only honest way to do it. He looked at his tea. Is this about the call with Patricia? She asked. Partly, he said. Partly, it's just... He rubbed the back of his neck. I have moments where I feel genuinely happy and then I feel guilty about it. Not because of you. You're not the problem in this equation. It's just... He shook his head. I know it doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't have to make logical sense, she said. It makes emotional sense. That's different. Is that what they teach you in whatever philosophy books you read at 3 a.m.? That's what they teach you after enough things go wrong and you have to figure out how to live in the aftermath, she said. There was something in her voice, not dark, but weighted. He looked at her. The scandal, he said. Among other things, she closed the laptop partially. When the investigation was happening, when my name was in the news every day and I didn't know which way it was going to fall, I had about 6 weeks of feeling like everything I'd built was going to be taken away from me based on something I didn't do. She was quiet for a moment. And the thing no one tells you about that is, after it was over, after I was cleared, I couldn't just be relieved. I was also angry, genuinely angry, at the people who doubted me, at the system that let it happen, at myself for not anticipating it. She paused, and I felt guilty about the anger because I was supposed to be grateful. It was over. I'd won. But the winning didn't undo the 6 weeks. Mason was quiet. What I'm saying, Evelyn said, is that I understand the arithmetic not adding up correctly. I understand feeling two things that logically contradict each other. She looked at him. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. I know, he said. Do you? He met her eyes. I'm getting there, he said. She nodded once. Then she opened her laptop again and went back to her work, and he sat with his tea and felt the thing he felt more and more often around her, the specific relief of being with someone who didn't require him to have everything resolved before he was allowed to speak. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Evelyn had to go to New York. She went to New York regularly. He'd known this. She'd told him early on that the company's main office was there, that she went at minimum twice a month. But those trips had happened during the carefully separate months, when her New York life was its own sealed thing and the apartment was simply empty for a few days. This trip was different because now there was something to be absent from. She told him on a Thursday evening, 3 days, leaving Sunday, back Wednesday. Board meeting, investor dinner, a deposition related to a loose thread from the original investigation that her lawyers were handling but needed her present for. She said it matter-of-factly, in the way she reported logistical facts, but he could hear the thing underneath it, the slight tightening in her voice when she mentioned the deposition. The investigation is still going on, he said. A civil suit from a former board member, she said. My lawyers say it's going nowhere. I believe them. But going nowhere still requires you to show up and answer questions, so... She moved her shoulders. 3 days. Are you okay? She looked at him. I've been doing this for 18 months. She paused. I'm functional. I know how to handle it. That's not what I asked. A longer pause. No, she said. I hate it. I hate going into a room and having someone try to build a story out of things I did legitimately and frame them as evidence of something I didn't do. Her jaw tightened. I hate that it's still happening. I thought clearing my name would end it, and it ended most of it. And there's still this one. She stopped. I'm fine. I have good lawyers. I know you do, he said. I'm still asking if you're okay. She looked at him. The measuring look she sometimes gave him when he pressed on something, the look that was deciding whether to trust the question with an honest answer. I'm scared, she said, finally. Not that I'll lose. My lawyers are right, it's going nowhere. But every time I have to go into one of those rooms, I'm scared that I'll sit down and it'll feel like the beginning again. She exhaled. It's a stupid fear. No, it's not, he said. It's not logical. Stop qualifying it. It's not stupid. She looked at him. You went through something genuinely hard, he said. Having feelings about it doesn't need a logic defense. Something in her face shifted. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Then she looked away toward the window, in the way she did when she needed a moment. He let her have it. When she looked back, her voice was steadier. Can we do something normal this weekend? Before I go? I don't want to spend 3 days before a New York trip thinking about New York. What's something normal? I don't know. Something that Lily wants to do. Something boring. Take me somewhere mundane. He thought about it. Lily's been asking to go to that thing at the shed, some kind of special jellyfish exhibit. Perfect, Evelyn said. Jellyfish are objectively strange, and I would like to look at them. You want to spend your Saturday at an aquarium. I want to spend my Saturday not thinking about depositions, she said. The jellyfish are incidental. The Saturday at the shed aquarium was the first time they'd been anywhere together, the three of them, that felt unambiguously like what it was. Not three people who happened to share an apartment, not a roommate joining a father-daughter outing. Something else. Something they'd been building without a name for it. Lily led the way through every exhibit with the authority of someone who had researched the venue extensively, which she'd looked up every current exhibit the night before and had opinions about optimal viewing order. She was particularly interested in the jellyfish, which drifted in their illuminated tanks with the indifferent beauty of things that had existed for 600 million years and didn't need human approval. They have no brain, Lily told Evelyn, pressing her nose against the tank glass. That's not entirely accurate, Evelyn said. They have a distributed nervous system. It's like having a brain that's spread through your whole body. Lily pulled back from the glass and looked at her. You know everything. I know jellyfish, Evelyn said. Why? I went through a marine biology phase when I was about your age, Evelyn said. I wanted to be an oceanographer. Lily looked at her with the focused attention she gave to genuinely surprising information. What happened? I got interested in something else, Evelyn said, and then something else after that. What if you'd stayed with the fish? Evelyn thought about it. I'd probably be somewhere cold and very wet, I think. Lily considered the jellyfish. I think I want to be a paleontologist, she said, or an astronaut, or the person who names new animals. Taxonomist, Evelyn said. That one, Lily agreed. Mason stood slightly behind them both, watching. He had a picture of them from 10 minutes earlier, Lily pointing at something, Evelyn leaning in to see, that he'd taken on his phone without them noticing. He didn't post it anywhere. He wasn't ready for it to exist anywhere except on his phone, privately. In the way that the most important things tend to live for a while before they're ready for the world. He wasn't prepared for what happened in the shark tunnel. The shark tunnel was a long curved walkway beneath a tank, so you could see the sharks swimming overhead and to the sides, surrounded entirely by water and the strange slow-motion choreography of large fish. Lily had run ahead to a better vantage point and was standing 30 feet away with her nose tipped up, watching a sand tiger shark pass overhead with undisguised reverence. Evelyn was standing next to Mason. The light in the tunnel was dim and blue, the way aquarium light always is, making everything look like the bottom of something deep. She was watching the sharks the way she sometimes watched things she found beautiful, quietly, without performing appreciation, just actually having it. I don't want to go to New York, she said quietly. I know. I've never not wanted to go to New York before. She glanced at him. That's new. Is that a bad thing? It means I have something I'd rather be doing. She turned back to the sharks. I've spent a long time not having things I'd rather be doing. It's a more complicated feeling than I expected. Because now there's something to lose, he said. She looked at him. Yeah. He reached over and found her hand in the blue underwater light, the way he'd found it on the couch that first night. And she laced her fingers through his, and they stood there watching the sharks move overhead, while Lily narrated from 30 feet away with mounting enthusiasm about the dietary habits of the sand tiger, and the aquarium moved around them with its crowds and its filtered light. And Mason thought, this specific Wednesday afternoon, this specific person, this specific ridiculous, beautiful, terrible, difficult thing that was still so new he was scared to press on it too hard. He thought about Patricia saying, burn the grilled cheese if she's there, it means she's home. He thought about Evelyn's room with the drawing on the inside of the door. He thought about 3 years of learning how to want nothing, and one Tuesday in October when he'd bought tulips for the wrong person and come home to find the right one waiting. Lily came sprinting back through the tunnel. The beluga whales are next, and I read that one of them recently learned to make a new sound, and I need to see this immediately. Lead the way. Evelyn said, and released Mason's hand and followed Lily down the tunnel. Mason stood there for a half-second alone in the blue light. Then he followed them both. Sunday came too fast. Evelyn left before 7 in the morning, car service to O'Hare, the kind of early that meant packing the night before and moving through the apartment in the pre-dawn quiet without waking anyone. She'd said goodbye to Mason the night before, standing in the hallway, and told him she'd call when she landed. He'd walked her to the door anyway in the morning, still in the clothes he'd slept in, squinting against the hallway light. She was in full professional mode, the coat, the structured bag, the particular composure that she wore when she was about to go be Evelyn Carter publicly rather than just Evelyn. She looked at him in that mode, and he looked at her and he thought about the woman in the Northwestern t-shirt on the kitchen floor talking about jellyfish and how both of those were the same person and how that was something he was still learning how to hold. "Call me when you land," he said. "I will." And after the deposition, she looked at him. "I'm fine. I know you are. Call me anyway." Something shifted in her face, briefly. That unguarded thing. She reached up and pressed her palm briefly to his jaw, and he put his hand over hers, and she said, "Yeah, okay." And then she went. He stood in the doorway of the apartment for a moment, listening to the elevator arrive and the doors close. The apartment felt different in her absence. Not empty, exactly. It still had its warmth, its particular character, Lily's dinosaur drawings, and the second electric blanket folded on the arm of the couch, and the blue mug still in the drying rack. It had all the evidence of a life that had been going on and would continue to. But it had a shape missing from it now, a specific presence that had been here for 11 months and had gone from background to something he measured the space against. He went back inside. He made coffee. He woke Lily. He got her to school with her backpack and her lunch and her folder, and came back to the apartment and stood in the kitchen that felt quiet in a way it hadn't felt quiet before. His phone buzzed. Landed. O'Hare to JFK, 3 hours, going straight to lawyers. A pause. Then, "The coffee on the plane was terrible. I should have taken yours." He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, "There's still some in the pot. I'll save it for Wednesday." Her response took 30 seconds. "That's the worst coffee offer I've ever received." "You'll take it anyway," he typed. A longer pause. Then, "Yes, I will." He set the phone down. He stood in the kitchen of the apartment on North Halsted, and the city went about its gray November business beyond the window, and something that had started with yellow tulips and a canceled date and a confession on a rainy night sat in the apartment like a living thing, warm and uncertain and real. He turned off the extra burner. He did the dishes. He went to work. Evelyn came back from New York on a Wednesday evening, as scheduled, and Mason knew before she walked through the door that the trip had cost her something. She'd called after the deposition on Monday. He'd been in the back room at the bookstore, pulling inventory, and he'd stepped outside into the November cold to take it. She'd been fine. Factually, procedurally fine. Her lawyers were satisfied the opposing counsel had found nothing useful. The deposition had been 4 hours of grinding through documentation that led nowhere. She'd described all of this with the clipped efficiency of someone reporting a task completed. He'd listened to all of it and then said, "How are you actually?" And she'd been quiet for a moment and said, "Tired. I'll be home Wednesday." She'd said home without registering it. He'd registered it. When she came through the door Wednesday evening, heels off first, coat second, the ritual intact but slower than usual. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the controlled way she put her bag down, that told him the 3 days had ground on her in ways the phone calls hadn't fully conveyed. She looked like someone who had been performing competence for 72 hours straight and was now in the one place they didn't have to. Lily was still awake, barely. She'd negotiated a 9 o'clock bedtime by claiming she wasn't tired, which was proven false by the fact that she was asleep on the couch under a blanket at 8:50, one sock off, a dinosaur encyclopedia open on her chest. Mason had left her there because moving her risked waking her in the negotiation process of getting her back to sleep was something he only engaged with when absolutely necessary. Evelyn saw her on the couch and stopped. Something in her face did the thing. The brief, undefended thing that happened when she wasn't braced for a feeling. "She waited up," Mason said quietly from the kitchen. "She did not have to do that," Evelyn said, equally quiet. "Try telling her that." Evelyn stood there for another moment looking at his daughter, asleep under her blanket, And then she set her bag down carefully and walked to the couch and picked up the dinosaur encyclopedia and set it on the coffee table and pulled the blanket up slightly, and Lily stirred but didn't wake. Mason watched all of this from the kitchen doorway. When Evelyn straightened up and turned around, she looked at him with an expression that was entirely open. No layering, no management, just the tiredness and the relief of being in a room where neither was a problem. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "Sit down. I'll get you something." She sat at the kitchen table while he reheated the soup he'd made that afternoon, the one she liked, with the white beans and the greens, that she'd told him once she'd eaten 3 bowls of at a restaurant in New York and never found a version of again. He'd figured it out from her description over the course of 2 attempts, which he'd presented as accidental and which had been nothing of the sort. She held the bowl in both hands and didn't say anything for a while. He sat across from her. The kitchen was warm and quiet. The November wind was doing something unpleasant to the windows, and the apartment's heating system was making its 3 a.m. furniture dragging noise 2 hours early, but neither of those things registered as problems. "The deposition was fine," she said eventually. "I know. Legally, strategically, my lawyers were—" "Evelyn." She stopped. "You don't have to report it to me," he said. "I'm not asking for a briefing." She looked at her soup. "I know that." "Then just eat the soup." She ate the soup. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, that has weight without being heavy. After a while she said, without looking up, "The opposing counsel asked me about the months after the investigation closed. My activities, my state of mind, my living situation. It was a fishing expedition," my lawyer told me afterward. "They were hoping I'd said something incriminating in an unguarded moment." She paused. "They asked about my living arrangements." Mason looked at her. "I told them I was renting privately," she said, "which is true. They didn't push on it. But for about 30 seconds, I was sitting in that room thinking about how it would look. If they'd pushed." He understood what she was saying. The optics of a billionaire CEO renting a room in a walk-up apartment under a false professional identity, living with a man she was now in a relationship with. The story it could be made into by someone motivated to make it into something. "And," he said, she looked up at him, "and I thought, I don't care. I thought about it, I did the calculation, and I landed on, I don't care how it looks, I care how it is." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you because I want you to know I did the calculation, with full information, and that's where I landed." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" She seemed to expect more. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, thank you for telling me." She studied him for a moment like she was checking for the thing underneath the word, waiting for the caveat, the however, the complication. He didn't have one. He meant it straight. She seemed to realize this, and something in her posture settled, a degree of tension that had apparently been there since Monday leaving quietly. "You're very uncomplicated about things that should be complicated," she said. "I've learned to pick which things to complicate," he said. She finished the soup. He cleared the bowl. They carried Lily to her room, a 2-person operation that involved Mason lifting her carefully and Evelyn getting the door and pulling back the covers, the small practiced teamwork of people who had been doing this together long enough that it required no discussion. Lily muttered something incomprehensible that might have been jellyfish and rolled over and went back to sleep without fully surfacing. Standing in the hallway afterward, Evelyn leaned against the wall and looked at him and said, "I miss this." "The hallway?" "All of it." She gestured vaguely. "The whole thing." He nodded. "Good." That's a very self-satisfied response. "I know," he said. She pressed her lips together against a smile. "Good night, Mason." "Good night." She went into her room. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular quiet of a Wednesday night with everyone home, and thought about her saying, "I'll be home Wednesday" on the phone from New York without realizing she'd said it. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. The thing about real relationships, the thing that movies and every shorthand version of romance tends to skip, is the part where daily life doesn't pause because something significant is happening. November didn't stop for Mason and Evelyn. The bookstore had its pre-holiday inventory push. Meridian had its quarterly filing. Lily had school, homework, the ongoing diplomatic situation with Cassie that had partially resolved and then partially re-escalated and then reached a kind of uneasy détente. The apartment heating system broke entirely for 3 days, resulting in a period of everyone wearing coats inside and a repair process that involved a building maintenance person named Gerald, who arrived 2 hours late and left with the heat fixed and one of Lily's dinosaur encyclopedias under his arm because she'd given him a reading recommendation while he worked. In the middle of all of this, something shifted in how they argued. The first real argument was small in the way that first real arguments usually are. The subject matter inconsequential, the underlying thing more significant. It was a Saturday in late November. Evelyn was working from the kitchen table on something that required intense focus, laptop open, phone next to it, a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. Lily had a school friend over, a girl named Morgan who was quiet and observant and had the specific social intelligence of a child who had learned to read rooms. The two of them were in Lily's room, doing something that involved occasional bursts of laughter, and at one point,
A loud thump followed by silence, followed by Lily calling out, "We're fine, hush, Pascan."
Mason was cleaning the apartment, which he did on Saturdays with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had accepted domestic order as one of the few things he could actually control. He vacuumed. He did the bathroom. He got to the kitchen. "Can you move over?" he said, meaning the laptop and the papers spread across half the table. Evelyn looked up from her screen. "Give me 5 minutes." 15 minutes later, the papers were still there. He came back with the cleaning supplies and said, "Evelyn, 2 more minutes." "You said 5 minutes 20 minutes ago." She looked up with the particular focus-interrupted look of someone mid-thought who has not fully returned from wherever they were. "I'm in the middle of something." "You're always in the middle of something," he said. There was a beat. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He set down the spray bottle. He heard, faintly, Lily's room. Laughter, Morgan's voice, a normal Saturday. "It means the kitchen table is also a shared space," he said, "and I've been asking you for 20 minutes. I said I'd move in a few minutes. You said 5 minutes, then 2 minutes. That's not the same thing." Her jaw tightened slightly. He recognized it. The micro-expression of someone shifting from defensive to analytical. "You could have cleaned the rest of the apartment and come back." "I did clean the rest of the apartment," he said, "and came back." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. The argument was, on its surface, about a table. It was not, underneath, only about a table. They both knew this. "I know the work is important," he said, making an effort to level his voice. "I've never asked you to stop working. I'm asking for 6 square feet of table space on a Saturday afternoon." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gathered her papers, closed her laptop, and moved to the couch without another word. The silence that followed had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. He cleaned the table. He was thorough and methodical and did not feel particularly good about winning the 6 square feet. An hour later, Morgan's mother picked Morgan up. Lily came out to the kitchen for a snack and correctly assessed the energy in the apartment and took her snack back to her room with the tactical wisdom of a 7-year-old who knew when adults needed space. Evelyn was still on the couch. She'd been working again, but the laptop was closed now, and she was looking at the window with the expression of someone turning something over. Mason came and sat in the armchair. "I shouldn't have made it bigger than it was," he said. She looked at him. "I should have moved the papers." "Yeah," he said. "You should have." She exhaled through her nose. "I got absorbed in what I was doing, and I dismissed you when you asked, and that was—" She looked at the closed laptop. "I do that. I get into something and everything peripheral goes on mute. It's a thing I'm not great at managing." "I've noticed," he said. "I know you've noticed." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you it's a pattern, not a choice. I'm not choosing to mute you, but I understand that the effect is the same." He looked at her. "I got sharp about it. You're always in the middle of something. That wasn't fair." "It's also not entirely wrong," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not entirely wrong." They sat with the uncomfortable accuracy of that for a moment. The argument hadn't been about the table. It had been about whether she was going to bring all of herself into this shared life or leave the professional self at the kitchen table as a standing obstruction. He hadn't said that directly. He wasn't sure he'd fully articulated it to himself until this moment. She seemed to follow the thread. "I'm not good at boundaries," she said, "between work and not work. I've never had to be. I've lived alone since I was 24, and the space was always mine to fill however I needed to. I know, he said. I'm aware that living with a person is different, she said. I'm working on it. I'm not asking you to stop working, he said again, because it still felt important to say. I like that you work. I like watching you do it, actually, which is probably slightly strange. You get this, he gestured vaguely, focus. Like the world has narrowed to one thing. It's impressive. She looked at him. You're complimenting me mid-argument. I'm post-argument now, he said. I've moved on. Something in her face shifted, the tension bleeding out slowly, replaced by the slightly exasperated warmth she had when he said something that undercut her expectations. You're impossible. I've been told I'm even-keeled, he said. By who? By you, actually. She shook her head and looked at the ceiling briefly, the gesture of a woman who is working very hard not to smile. The papers will stay in my room, she said. From now on, when I'm working at the table, I'll keep it contained. That would be good, he said. And you can tell me when I've gone on mute, she said. I mean that. Don't let it build. I'd rather you say something in the moment. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Okay? Okay, he said. That works. It wasn't a dramatic resolution. There was no cathartic moment, no embrace that scored the scene. It was just two people who had disagreed about something real, said what was actually true, and found a workable way forward, which Mason had come to believe was considerably more valuable than drama. Lily reappeared in the doorway a few minutes later, assessed the room, concluded that conditions had improved, and announced that she was hungry for an early dinner. There's leftover soup, Mason said. I want grilled cheese, she said and looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Mason. I can make grilled cheese, Mason said. She wants me to make it, Evelyn said. I didn't say that, Lily said. You looked at me, Evelyn said. I was looking at the general area, Lily said with dignity. Mason stood up. I'll make grilled cheese. Don't burn it, Lily said. I don't. Every time, Lily and Evelyn said, again simultaneously. And this time the timing was so precise that they both looked at each other, and Evelyn laughed first, the real one, the surprised one. And Lily laughed because Evelyn laughed, and Mason stood in the kitchen making grilled cheese with an extremely reasonable level of heat and thought that the afternoon had turned out all right after all. The Thanksgiving question arrived the following Monday, and it was, in retrospect, the first moment where the weight of what they were building became fully visible. Patricia called on her regular schedule. She asked about Lily. She asked about Mason. And then she said carefully, I was thinking about Thanksgiving. I'd like to do it here in Evanston, same as usual. And I was wondering, a pause. Would Evelyn be joining? Mason was at the bookstore. He went to the back room. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I haven't asked. I think she should be invited, Patricia said. If this is real, I'd like her to be there. He understood the weight of the offer. Thanksgiving with Patricia had been, for 3 years, a carefully held ritual. Her house in Evanston, Sophie's old bedroom converted to a guest room. The particular gravitational pull of a table where Sophie's absence was always the largest presence. It was not a light invitation. It was an act of deliberate generosity from a woman who had every right to guard that table. Let me ask her, he said. He told Evelyn that evening. They were in the kitchen after dinner, Lily already in her room, the apartment in its evening quiet. He tried to frame it neutrally, just the invitation, the context, the option to decline without consequence. But he could hear as he talked that neutral wasn't quite achievable because the invitation wasn't neutral. Evelyn listened to all of it. Sophie's mother wants me at her Thanksgiving table, she said when he finished. Yes, she stopped. That's a significant thing to offer someone. I know. She hasn't met me. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. What do you want? She asked. He thought about it honestly. I want you there, he said. I want Lily to have Thanksgiving that feels whole. And I think, he paused. I think the only way this works long term is if the people who matter to me know each other. And Patricia matters to me. She looked at him. Long term, she said. Yes, he said. Something passed through her face. Not hesitation, the other thing. The thing where a word lands somewhere real and she has to do something with it before she can respond. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, you'll come? Okay, I'll come, she said. And okay to the thing you said after, the long-term thing. He looked at her across the kitchen table. I'm not casual about this, she said, and her voice was steady but had that quality under it. The real Evelyn quality. The one without the professional finish. I want you to know that. I don't do things I'm not serious about, and I'm serious about this. I know you are, he said. I don't know what it looks like, she said. The long term. I don't know if I'll be in Chicago. I don't know what my company needs from me in the next year. I don't know how any of that fits with. She made the small gesture that meant everything. I'm not trying to complicate it. I'm trying to be honest. I know, he said. I'm not asking for a plan. I'm just telling you what I want. She held his gaze. What do you want? He said it simply. For this to keep going. However we figure out the shape of it. She nodded once and looked down, and he could see her jaw working slightly. The things she did when she was holding something together that wanted to come apart. She pressed her fingers briefly to the corner of her eye, which she would never acknowledge as the thing it was. And when she looked back up, her expression was steady. All right, she said. All right, he said. The week before Thanksgiving had its own compressed energy. Lily vibrating with holiday excitement that expressed itself as a sustained interest in Pilgrim history that lasted approximately 12 hours before she moved on to wanting to make a paper turkey. Evelyn, who had cleared her New York schedule for the Thursday and Friday, was in the particular productive state she got before taking time off, closing everything out, pre-answering the emails that would otherwise pile up, leaving her deputy director with enough guidance to handle a small crisis. The night before Thanksgiving, Mason found her at the kitchen table at 11 p.m., papers to one side, laptop closed, this boundary now reliably maintained, sitting with her tea and staring at something he couldn't see. Nervous? He said. She looked up. About Thanksgiving. Yes. A little, she said, which from Evelyn meant yes considerably. He sat down across from her. Patricia is not difficult, he said. She's direct. She'll ask you questions and she'll want real answers, not polished ones. She'll probably ask about your work and your family and whether you have any siblings. 2 brothers, Evelyn said. Both in Boston, one's in finance, one teaches high school. We're close enough. We talk at holidays. She'll like that. She hasn't met me. She already has an impression of you, he said, from what I told her, from what Lily talks about. He paused. Lily told her you know about jellyfish. Evelyn looked at him. That's my qualification? In Lily's world, yes. She pressed her lips together. What if she stopped, tried again. Sophie was her daughter. I understand that I'm asking her to do something very hard. Accept someone in her daughter's place not in her place, Mason said, firmly. Not anywhere near Sophie's place. Different entirely. I know the logic of it, Evelyn said. I'm telling you what it feels like from where I'm sitting. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what to say and decided the only useful thing was honesty. Patricia lost Sophie. She lost her daughter. Nothing makes that smaller or replaces it. But she called me and asked me to invite you. She did that. Not because she's past the grief. She'll never be past it. But because she's a person who understands that life keeps going and that I'm still alive and that Lily is still alive and that she loves us both and wants us to be okay. He paused. She's not going to compare you to Sophie. She's going to look at who you are with me and with Lily and make her own determination. Evelyn was quiet. And you'll be fine, he said, because you're actually a good person. Once people spend time with you, they figure that out. She looked at him. That's the second time tonight you've given me an accidental compliment. They're not accidental. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said. The word had a different texture this time, softer, more private. Or Thanksgiving at Patricia Reed's house in Evanston was not a large gathering. Patricia, Mason, Lily, and Evelyn, plus Patricia's neighbor Helen, who was 82 and showed up every year with a green bean casserole and opinions about everything, and who arrived, looked Evelyn directly in the eye and said, You're the one living with them. Are you going to stay? Helen, Patricia said. I'm 82, Helen said. I ask what I want. Evelyn looked at Helen with an expression that took about 1 second to settle into something dry and composed. I'm working on it, she said. Helen nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to find a seat. Patricia, for her part, was exactly what Mason had said: direct, warm, and interested in the real version of things. She asked Evelyn about her company and got a real answer. She asked about Boston and got a real answer. She asked, over dessert, when Lily had gone to watch something in the living room, how Evelyn had ended up in a walk-up apartment on North Halsted, and Evelyn told her the actual story, the investigation, the need for distance, the neighborhood app. Patricia listened to all of it and then said, "My daughter would have found that very interesting. She was in tech." Evelyn went still. "Nothing comparable," Patricia said. "She was a developer, mid-level. She liked the problem-solving part." She looked at the table. "She was stubborn about things she believed in. I think you two might have argued and then gotten along." Something in Evelyn's face moved. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I think I would have liked to know her." Patricia looked at her. Something passed across the older woman's face. Grief and gratitude, and the complexity of a person who has learned to hold more than one thing at once. "She would have liked that drawing Lily made," she said, and her voice was quiet. "The one with the laser eyes." Mason, across the table, looked at his plate. "She told me about it," Patricia said to Evelyn. "On the phone. She described it for approximately 5 minutes." Evelyn looked down. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "It's on my door," she said. "I see it every morning." Patricia looked at her steadily. Then she said, "Good," and reached over and patted Evelyn's hand once, briefly, firmly, the way people do when a word isn't enough, but a gesture does the work, and got up to check on the pie. Mason reached under the table and found Evelyn's hand and held it without looking at her, and she gripped back hard, harder than he expected, and neither of them said anything. In the living room, Lily was narrating something to Helen at considerable volume. The house smelled like food and the particular warmth of a place that had been lived in for decades. Outside, the first snow of the season had started while they weren't paying attention. The quiet, non-committal kind, just enough to dust the lawn and the street and the bare branches of the oak in the front yard. Lily noticed first, as they were putting on coats to leave, and pressed her face against the cold glass of the door, and said, with the reverence she usually reserved for significant paleontological discoveries, "It's snowing." Evelyn stood beside her and looked out. "First snow," Mason said. Lily turned around. "Can we stand in it?" "You'll get wet." For 1 minute, he looked at Evelyn. She was already putting her coat back on. They stood on Patricia's front lawn in the first snow of November. Mason, Lily, and Evelyn, their breath visible, the snow coming down in small, indifferent flakes. And Lily held out both hands to catch snow that melted before it accumulated, and laughed at the temperature. And Evelyn tipped her face up briefly with her eyes closed in the way she had of sometimes just receiving something without analyzing it. Patricia watched from the doorway, and Mason glanced back and saw her watching, and she nodded once, not performing it, not making it a moment, just acknowledging something she could see plainly. He turned back to the snow. Behind them, the house held its warmth and its history, and the complicated human weight of love that survives loss. Ahead, the street was going white, gradually, without hurry. Lily said, "Okay, I'm cold," and went back inside. Evelyn lowered her face from the snow and looked at Mason with snowflakes in her hair and the cold bringing color to her face and said, "Your daughter has no romance in her soul." "She's 7, he said. "I knew I liked snow at 7. "You also hated the cold at 7. "That's irrelevant," she said, and he laughed, and she laughed, and the snow kept falling, and somewhere behind them Helen was telling Lily something about the winter of 1987 that Lily was accepting as authoritative, and the night was cold and ordinary and full of something that didn't have a name yet, but was getting closer to one. He brushed snow off her shoulder. She didn't say thank you, she just looked at him, that direct look, the undefended one. And he looked back. And between them was the whole accumulated weight of what the last 2 months had built, the arguments and the soup and the jellyfish and the deposition and the kitchen floor and the drawing on the inside of the door. "Come on," he said. "It's cold." "It absolutely is," she said, and they went inside. December came in full and cold and lit, the way Chicago Decembers do when the city decides to compensate for the darkness by covering everything in light. The streets of the neighborhood went up with strings of white bulbs overnight, and the Vietnamese sandwich shop downstairs put a wreath on the door, and the dry cleaner next door taped a hand-drawn snowflake to their window that Lily had apparently contributed to after befriending the owner's son at some point in October. Mason had not known this friendship existed until the snowflake appeared. This was, he'd come to understand, a standard feature of life with Lily, relationships she cultivated quietly, then revealed through their products. The apartment itself had been slowly accumulating December the way it accumulated everything now, not through grand gestures, but through small deposits. Lily's paper chain, red and green, strung across the living room window. The pine-scented candle Evelyn had bought without comment and placed on the kitchen counter where it burned in the evenings and made the whole apartment smell like something from another latitude. The Christmas cards on the shelf, 2 from friends, 1 from Derek, 1 from Patricia that arrived 4 days after Thanksgiving with a note inside that said, "Only, Lily told me you know about jellyfish. I told her I know about everything else. Welcome to the table." Evelyn had read it twice and put it at the front of the shelf where it was the first thing visible. What Mason noticed most about December was that Evelyn laughed more. Not the social laugh, not the professionally calibrated one, the real one, the surprised one, the kind that got away from her before she could manage it. It happened more often now, usually when Lily said something unexpected, sometimes when Mason said something that landed sideways, occasionally just in response to a situation. The heating system's 3 a.m. furniture sound now reliably produced a particular exhale from her, something between a sigh and a laugh, the sound of a person who has stopped being surprised by a thing and started being fond of it. He cataloged these moments the way he cataloged other things now, not out of anxiety, not because he was building a case for something, but because he'd spent long enough not noticing good things that noticing them had become deliberate. A practice. Like maintenance on something you'd learned the cost of losing. The civil suit was dismissed on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December. Evelyn got the call at 8:15 sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, the one in the blue mug. Mason was making Lily's lunch. Lily was looking for a shoe that had achieved the specific invisibility that one shoe of a pair always achieves in households with children. He heard Evelyn's voice change, not dramatically, but the register shifted. The particular tightening of someone receiving information they'd been waiting for with the careful non-attachment of a person who'd learned not to count on things until they were final. "Understood," she said. "Thank you, James." A pause. "No, just thank you." She set the phone down on the table. Mason turned from the counter. She was looking at the coffee mug, both hands around it, not moving. "Evelyn." She looked up. "Good news?" She exhaled, slow, controlled, the breath of someone releasing something they'd been holding for 18 months. "Dismissed," she said, with prejudice. "He can't refile." She paused. "It's over." Mason set down the sandwich he'd been making. He crossed the kitchen and put both hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and pressed one of her hands over his, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment didn't need language. He felt the tension under her shoulders. The deep structural tension of a person who had been braced for impact for so long, the bracing had become the baseline, and then felt it, incrementally, begin to release. Lily emerged from this hallway holding the missing shoe triumphantly. She clocked the energy in the kitchen with her usual precision. "Did something happen?" "Something good," Mason said. Lily looked at Evelyn. "What kind of good?" Evelyn looked at her. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with crying and everything to do with the way relief sits in the body when it finally arrives after too long. "The kind where something hard is finished," she said. Lily thought about this. "Like when I finished the water cycle poster?" "Somewhat larger than that," Evelyn said, "but the same principle." Lily nodded, satisfied, sat down to put on her shoe and said, "Can we have pancakes for dinner tonight? For celebrating?" "We can have pancakes for dinner," Mason said. They had pancakes for dinner. It was a Wednesday. It was nobody's idea of a celebration except theirs, which made it exactly the right kind. What happened in the 2 weeks following the dismissal was something Mason had not quite prepared for, which was the experience of watching Evelyn become slightly more herself than she'd been before. It was not a dramatic transformation. She did not suddenly become a different person. But there was a quality that had been present in her since the day she'd moved in. A vigilance, a low-grade alertness, like someone who had learned to keep one eye on the door even in rooms they'd chosen, that began, gradually, to loosen. She slept later on weekends. She answered work calls with less of the preemptive defensiveness she'd carried for 18 months. She went to her New York meetings in December and came back without the 3-day decompression period. She started telling Mason things about her company that weren't crisis management but were simply interesting. The product decisions she was wrestling with, the people on her team she found remarkable, the way the company had evolved from the thing she'd imagined it to be to the thing it actually was, which she seemed to have made a specific peace with. She also, one evening in mid-December, sat down next to him on the couch and said, "I want to tell you something." He set down his book. "Okay." She had her hands in her lap, which was her tell, the thing she did when a conversation was going to require something from her. "When I moved in here," she said, "I told you I worked in tech consulting." "I remember." "I want to apologize for that," she said. "Not for needing the privacy. I stand by needing that, but for starting it with something that wasn't true. You were," she looked at her hands, "you were straightforwardly good to me from the beginning. You treated me like a person without knowing anything about me, and you deserved better than a half-truth for a foundation." He looked at her. "I figured it out," he said. "Not immediately, but within a few months." She looked up. "You knew?" "You got a call one night in March," he said. "You went into your room, but the walls aren't thick. I heard enough. I looked up Meridian Technologies the next morning." He paused. "I didn't say anything because it seemed like you'd tell me when you were ready." She stared at him. "You've known for 8 months, roughly. And you just waited," he said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he'd seen exactly once before. The first night, the rainy night, when she'd told him she wouldn't have turned him down. The undone expression, the one that happened when something got through all the architecture of composure she'd built. "You're a very unusual person," she said. "I've been told I'm even-keeled," he said. She made a sound that was half laugh, half something else, and pressed her fingers briefly to her forehead. "I've been carrying a guilt about that for months," she said. "The lying thing." "I know," he said. "I could tell." "You could tell, and you didn't say anything." "I was waiting for you to be ready," he said again. "You clearly were carrying enough without me adding to it." She looked at him for another long moment. He held the look evenly, the way he'd learned to, not aggressively, not performing patience, just actually there, actually waiting, the way he'd always been waiting, since the first morning she'd come into the kitchen in the Northwestern t-shirt, and he'd understood without articulating it that this person needed space and time and a particular kind of steadiness to find her way toward trust. "I don't know what I did to end up in this apartment," she said quietly. Not philosophically, practically. The actual question of how a sequence of events had landed her here, in this specific kitchen, with this specific man. "You responded to a listing on a neighborhood app within an hour," he said. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," he said. "I don't have an answer for it. I just think some things happen because you're both in the right place at the right time, and you're both honest enough with yourself to not walk away from it." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what we did? Not walk away?" "Repeatedly," he said. "And I'm glad we kept not walking away." She exhaled slowly and leaned her head back against the couch. Not away from him, just settling. The way she settled now when she was in the apartment, the gradual release of the heldness that was so much a part of her outside these walls. "Me too," she said, to the ceiling. It was the week before Christmas when the envelope arrived. Mason brought the mail up on a Thursday evening, a habit, part of the routine, sorting through the mostly irrelevant accumulation of circulars and bills and the occasional piece of mail for the previous tenant that still showed up despite 3 years of return to sender. He was in the kitchen making dinner when he saw the envelope from the management company. He recognized it by the logo. He'd gotten one last year at this time. The same envelope, the same logo. The annual notification about lease renewal. Last year he'd signed it at the kitchen counter, barely reading it, the way you do with documents that represent continuity of the status quo. He stood at the counter and held this year's version. Lily was doing homework at the table. The apartment smelled like garlic and the pine candle. Down the hall, from behind Evelyn's door, he could hear the low murmur of a work call. She'd been on and off since 6, a complicated situation with an overseas partner that her team was handling but required oversight. He set the envelope on the counter and finished making dinner. He did not mention it that evening. Not because he was hiding it, but because the work call ran late, and Lily needed help with math, and by the time the apartment settled into its evening quiet, the moment had passed into the natural holding pattern of tomorrow. What he was doing,
and he recognized this clearly enough to be honest about it with himself, was sitting with the question the envelope represented before he said anything out loud. Because the envelope was not just about rent. It was about what the next year looked like, and what the year after that looked like, and whether the thing they had built inside this apartment was something they were choosing to keep building, or something that had been situational all along. Evelyn's original plan had been several months. She was at 14. She hadn't mentioned leaving. He hadn't asked. Both of them had been operating in the extended present tense, which had felt right while the present was demanding enough. But the envelope was a formal question from the building management company, and formal questions require answers by specific dates, and the date on the envelope was January 15th. He thought about it on Friday. He worked a full day at the bookstore, a busy one. December at Renner and Sons was its own particular sustained chaos, the kind that Mason had learned to navigate over 5 years by staying methodical and not fighting the current. Derek, stacking a display of gift books, clocked Mason's expression mid-afternoon and said, "What are you turning over?" "The lease," Mason said. Derek looked at him, as in, "The building sent the renewal notice." Derek was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for Derek. Then, "Has she said anything?" "No." "Have you?" "Not yet." Derek set down a stack of books with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words. "Mason." "I know." "You have to ask her." "I know that." "Because not asking is also an answer," Derek said, "and it's the wrong one." Mason looked at the shelf he was organizing. "I know," he said for the third time, which was the answer a person gives when they know what they need to do and are standing at the edge of doing it. He asked her Friday night. Lily was at Patricia's for the weekend. The third time this had happened, Patricia having established a quiet pattern of taking Lily for occasional overnight visits that served the dual function of grandmother time, and, Mason suspected, the deliberate gift of space. Patricia was generous in ways that didn't announce themselves. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it got when Lily was gone. The same four walls, the same furniture, but with a register removed, the specific frequency of a 7-year-old's existence temporarily absent, and the space it left oddly large. Evelyn had made dinner this time. She cooked the way she did most things, competently and without ceremony, the result being always serviceable and occasionally excellent and never quite the same twice because she cooked from instinct rather than method. Tonight it was pasta with a sauce that had been simmering on the back burner for an hour while she finished her last call of the day, and which smelled considerably better than its assembly suggested. They ate at the kitchen table. The lease renewal envelope was on the counter behind him. He'd decided he was going to say something tonight, and then spent most of dinner thinking about how to start it, which meant he was quieter than usual, and Evelyn, who noticed everything, noticed. "Where are you?" she said. He looked at her. He reached behind him without getting up and put the envelope on the table between them. She looked at it, read the logo, looked up at him. "Lease renewal," he said. "It came Thursday." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been sitting with it for a couple of days," he said. "I didn't want to bring it up without thinking about what I actually wanted to say, so I'm going to say it now." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want you to renew because it's convenient. I don't want you to stay because it's the path of least resistance, or because leaving would be logistically complicated, or because you haven't found somewhere else." He paused. "I want you to stay because you want to be here, specifically. Because this is where you want to be." Evelyn looked at the envelope. "And if you don't know that yet," he said, "that's an honest answer, and we can talk about what that means. But I needed to ask the actual question instead of both of us just continuing without having said it out loud." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city was doing its December evening thing, the particular muffled quality of a city in winter, sound softened by cold air, the distant suggestion of other lives going on in lit windows. Evelyn pushed the envelope slightly to one side, like she was making room for the conversation. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Please?" 3 weeks after I moved in, she said, I had a terrible week. The media cycle was at its worst. I'd had a board call that lasted 4 hours and went nowhere. I hadn't slept properly in days. She looked at the table. "I came home at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday and you'd made dinner. Not for me specifically. You'd just made extra and left a plate covered on the counter with a post-it that said, 'If you haven't eaten.' You were already in your room. You didn't make it a thing." He remembered that. He remembered not remembering it. It had been an instinct, not a calculated gesture.
I sat at this counter and ate that dinner, she said, and for the first time in weeks I felt like a person instead of a headline. And I thought, she stopped. I thought, I need to be very careful about this place, because it would be very easy to need it. He looked at her. I've been careful, she said. I've been careful this whole time. About needing it too much. About letting it matter too much. About, she exhaled, about all the ways this could go wrong and take something irreplaceable with it. She met his eyes. But I'm tired of being careful about it. I'm tired of holding it at arm's length so it can't hurt me. Because it already matters. It already would hurt. The careful distance isn't protecting anything at this point. It's just distance. He was quiet. I want to stay, she said. Not because it's convenient. Not because it's easy. She looked at him with the direct, undefended look. Because this is the first place in a very long time that has felt like mine. Not because I own it or because I built it, but because, she stopped, found the word. Because I'm known here. You know me. Lily knows me. I can sing badly in the kitchen and read bad romance novels and have a terrible week and none of it has to be managed. It never had to be managed, he said. I know that now, she said. That's the point. I know that now. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the apartment that was theirs in every way that mattered, even if the lease only had one name on it, and felt the specific weight of a moment that was asking to be taken seriously. He took it seriously. I want to put your name on the lease, he said. She went still. Not as a gesture, he said. Not as a symbol. Because practically speaking, you've been here for 14 months, and you pay rent, and you live here, and it should say that officially. Mason. And because I want you to know that I'm not thinking about this in terms of months, he said. I'm not thinking about the original arrangement, or the consulting cover story, or the contingency you gave yourself when you moved in. I'm thinking about, he paused, about the thing Lily said, about the grilled cheese, about it meaning your home. He held her gaze. I want that to be a real thing, the home part. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He could see the work happening behind her eyes. Not the calculation she used professionally, the one that assessed risk and probability, but the other kind. The private arithmetic of a person weighing something real. I come with complications, she said. My company, the public profile, I know what you come with, he said. I've known for a while. I'm not confused about what I'm saying yes to. And I come without a guarantee, she said. I don't know what next year looks like. I don't know where Meridian needs me or how that intersects with Evelyn, he said. She stopped. I'm not asking for a guarantee, he said. I buried someone I loved. I know how guarantees work. I'm asking if you want to be here and if you want to try. That's all. The rest we figure out as it comes. Her jaw worked slightly. She looked down at the envelope on the table, and he watched her. The woman who had walked into his apartment 14 months ago with one suitcase and a box of books and a cover story and more armor than any one person should need, and who had over 14 months of dinners and homework and jellyfish and depositions and first snows and Thanksgiving tables, put the armor down piece by piece until what was left was just her. Actually, her. The real and imperfect and formidable and occasionally infuriating and genuinely extraordinary her. She reached over and picked up the envelope. She slid it across the table toward him. Put my name on the lease, she said. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, and then she said, I'm not going to cry about this. I know you're not. I'm categorically not. Understood? She pressed the back of her hand briefly to the corner of her eye. That was something else, she said. Something else, he agreed, completely straight-faced. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then, because neither of them could sustain it, they both laughed at the same time. The real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that belonged to two people who knew each other well enough to be ridiculous together. The night they signed the lease renewal, both names, Mason Reed and Evelyn Carter, on the line above the management company's logo. It was a Wednesday evening in early January. The Christmas decorations were still up, but the holiday rush had passed, and the city was in that particular January stillness, the post-celebration quiet when all the lights are still there, but the urgency has settled. Lily had watched them sign it with the focused attention of an official witness, and when it was done, she had asked with complete practical seriousness, "Does this mean Evelyn's staying?" "Yes," Mason said. Lily had nodded once the way she nodded when something she'd expected to eventually be true became officially true. "Good," she said, "because I need help with the science fair project, and Dad doesn't know anything about ecosystems." "I know about ecosystems," Mason said. "You thought a food chain was something you ordered at a restaurant," Lily said. "That was a joke." "It wasn't convincing," Lily said, and went back to her room. Evelyn looked at Mason with the careful expression of someone not laughing. "Not a word," he said. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't say anything." "You thought it very loudly." "I'm going to help her with the ecosystems project," she said, and went to get her jacket, because she and Lily had a standing Tuesday tradition of walking to the ice cream place on Clark Street that stayed open through winter on the logic that serious ice cream consumers were not deterred by cold, and tonight was Tuesday. Mason stood in the kitchen and watched them go. Lily at the door pulling on her coat with the chaotic speed of a child who couldn't be bothered with zippers. Evelyn crouching down to help with the stuck toggle on Lily's jacket. The two of them talking about something he couldn't hear through the closing door. He stood in the apartment alone for a moment. It was a two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a narrow building on North Halsted. The walls were off-white with a yellow undertone. The heating system made a sound at 3 a.m. like furniture being rearranged. The bathroom got cold in winter. There were dinosaur stickers on the hallway wall and a pine-scented candle on the kitchen counter, and 2 names on the lease now. He thought about 3 years ago. The man who had moved into this apartment with a 4-year-old and a grief so large he hadn't been able to see around it, who had made himself functional through sheer stubbornness and the particular obligation of being someone's only parent, who had learned to want very small things because small things were what he could afford to lose. He thought about the version of himself 8 months ago, ironing a shirt for a date he was approaching with calibrated, managed hopefulness, buying yellow tulips for a woman he didn't know, performing the motions of a man trying to move forward while standing in the kitchen of a life that was already fuller than he'd allowed himself to recognize. He thought about Evelyn at the airport, calling this place home without realizing she'd said it. He thought about grief, not Sophie's death specifically, but what grief teaches you if you let it, which is that permanence was always an illusion, and the only honest response to that is to be fully present to what's actually here. Not careful, not managed. Present. The thing he'd been learning and failing at and learning again for 3 years, and which love, messy, inconvenient, complicated, real love, had finished teaching him in the last 4 months. He'd believed for a long time that the lesson of losing Sophie was that he should want less. Hold lighter. Keep himself at a slight distance from happiness, so the distance would soften any future fall. He understood now that he'd gotten it exactly backwards. The lesson was the opposite. That you hold the things that matter more tightly, more honestly, more completely. Not because holding tight prevents loss, because nothing prevents loss, but because the holding is the point. The being here is the point. The Tuesday evenings, and the burned grilled cheese, and the water cycle poster, and the jellyfish in the blue light, and the first snow on a lawn in Evanston. The being here. That is the whole thing. He heard the elevator in the hallway, and then the voices. Lily's at full volume, Evelyn's lower, both overlapping the way their conversations always overlapped, the particular frequency of 2 people who had found their rhythm. And the door opened and cold air came in with them, and Lily was already talking about the ice cream she'd had, and Evelyn was making the specific face she made when something Lily said surprised her into paying full attention, and the apartment absorbed them both the way it absorbed everything now. Easily, completely, like they'd always been part of the architecture. "We got you one," Lily said, holding out a container. "Butter pecan. Evelyn said that's your favorite." "It is," Mason said, slightly surprised. "I pay attention," Evelyn said, hanging her coat, not making it a thing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Lily was already at the table, eating her ice cream, explaining to no one in particular the taxonomy of ice cream flavors and why mint chocolate chip was scientifically superior to all others. And the apartment was warm and the candle was going and the lease with both their names on it was on the counter by the door. He thought about a Tuesday in October. Yellow tulips for the wrong person. Rain. A door opening. A woman in socked feet saying, "I wouldn't have turned you down." He thought about what an unlikely, difficult, unglamorous, entirely ordinary miracle it was to be standing in a small kitchen on North Halsted on a January night with ice cream and a 7-year-old and a woman who paid attention to his favorite flavor and didn't make it a thing. Not because it was perfect. It was not perfect. It was two people with damage and history and complicated lives trying to build something real inside the ordinary Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of it, which was harder than the romantic version and worth considerably more. He opened the butter pecan. Lily said, "Evelyn thinks mint chocolate chip is just okay, which is wrong." "Objectively inaccurate," Evelyn said. "It's iconic," Lily said. "Iconic is not the same as good," Evelyn said. "Dad," Lily said, appealing. "I'm not getting involved," Mason said. "That's very cowardly," Lily said. "It is," he agreed. "I'm comfortable with that." Evelyn looked at him over Lily's head. That look, the warm, private, undefended one that he'd spent 11 months not letting himself read too clearly and now didn't have to manage at all. He looked back. Something passed between them that didn't require words because it had been accumulating for months and had found its level now, its natural resting place, the way water finds its own surface. Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, cold and lit and indifferent to individual stories in the best possible way. The way a city is indifferent, which means your life is yours, fully, to be lived inside it without the city weighing in. Inside the apartment on North Halsted, a single father ate ice cream and listened to his daughter make the case for mint chocolate chip with the sustained passion of a born advocate, and the woman who had walked into his life on the pretense of needing a quiet room had her feet tucked under her on the couch and was arguing back with genuine investment, and the walls held all of it: the history, the grief, the new thing, the complicated ongoing project of two imperfect people choosing each other on purpose, in the full knowledge of what they each came with. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. The tulips from that October Tuesday were long gone, wilted and thrown away the morning after the night that changed everything, their purpose having been surpassed by something they only accidentally started. But the yellow they'd been, the particular stubborn color of something bought in hope on a rainy evening for a night that turned out to be the wrong night for the right reason, that stayed. Some things do.